It's been a while since I've made a new video for my series on lost films of the 1920s, but I'm currently working on a new one. Before that though, I thought I'd put together this compilation of all my previous lost film videos. For those of you who started following the channel after my last Lost Films video, or just haven't watched them before, I just want to quickly explain what I do in these videos and why I make them. Only a few especially important lost films get a lot of attention, but there were plenty of other, lesser-known ones that are actually really interesting in the proper context. So I scour old movie and industry magazines and that kind of stuff to try and find as much information about movies, good or bad, that are lost. So, for each lost film I feature in these videos, I provide a detailed plot summary, some background and context, whether or not the movie influenced or was influenced by something, and whether the movie succeeded or failed critically and at the box office. Keep in mind that this video won't cover all lost films from the 1920s, but only some that I thought had interesting stories behind them. But I'll continue to cover a lot more of them in the future. And for those of you who've already watched my original Lost Film videos, I've made some changes here and there and re-recorded more than half of the segments, so hopefully that makes this video worth watching. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's get into it. First up is one of the films I briefly talked about a while ago when I made my first video on lost films, and it's a big one, Flaming Youth from 1923, which is at the top of my personal list. The reason is because it contributed significantly to the flapper craze that the 1920s is now known for. Another reason why I want to see Flaming Youth so badly is because it starred Colleen Moore, who was the first actress to really make a career out of flapper roles. But the sad truth is that many of her flapper films are lost, which means that they will definitely come up in future videos in this series. Moore's career up to that point had been mostly standard drama roles, and she had some modest success with that, but she probably would have faded into obscurity if she had never become a screen flapper. There is some surviving footage from Flaming Youth. I think it's only one reel or something like that. I've used that footage quite a bit on this channel, but most of it is just Colleen Moore putting on makeup. It's entertaining, sure, but it doesn't really tell us much about the story. Okay, so what was the story? I stitched together a few different plot summaries into one that is more detailed than any of them on their own, so here it goes. Mrs. Fentress, because of her husband's neglect, plunges in for a round of gaiety and jazz, and two of her daughters, following suit, contract unhappy marriages. She seeks, however, to be more of a real old-fashioned mother to her youngest daughter, Patricia. Patricia Fentress grows up as the daughter of a mother who turned her home into a neighborhood, and with a father who found his pleasure wherever he could, and she steps into the world of jazz with only her own natural emotions to guide her. Pat, as she is called, tries whatever she sees other girls doing, including cuddling into the arms of every man she meets. Being stricken with heart trouble from overexcitement, Mrs. Fentress dies after telling her friend, Dr. Bobbs, about Carrie Scott, the one man she really loves, and making Bobbs promise to write her regularly about Pat, placing the letters in a wall safe. Previous to her death of heart failure, Mrs. Fentress called Pat to her and told her the combination of the wall safe. Through these letters, she learns how her acts are regarded by another. Carrie Scott calls to see Mrs. Fentress, not knowing that she has died, and he becomes the one stabilizing influence in Pat's life. After a while, they learn to love each other, but Carrie cannot marry her until he gets a divorce from his wife, from whom he is estranged. Pat, disillusioned because of the unhappy marriages around her, hesitates to marry. She seeks solace in the company of a violinist who proves to be a cad. Her better self asserts itself. She jumps into the river. A sailor rescues her. After that terrifying experience, she comes home ill and near death. Carrie returns and he and the doctor try to revive her. Finally, it seems as if the influence of her dead mother's spirit has helped her and spoken through her, for she recovers and finds happiness in marriage with Scott. I think most people can imagine the aspects of the movie that were considered edgy for the time. Even in the early 1920s, jazz was associated with immorality for a lot of people, and a young woman being shown willingly cuddling into the arms of every man she meets and going to petting parties was downright scandalous. The makers of this movie knew what they were getting into, and they doubled down. One of the most memorable scenes that was often mentioned in reviews was when at a pool party, all of the guests get at least partly undressed and jump into the pool. This scene didn't get censored because it was cleverly shot in silhouette, so nothing could actually be seen. But Flaming Youth didn't completely escape censorship. The movie was banned in its entirety in Canada, despite the fact that it had been passed by a board of censors and had previously been shown in Montreal without any problems. The Empire Theatre in Quebec showed the movie before this ban occurred, and the owner was actually arrested for showing it when the movie was suddenly banned shortly afterward, and the lobby cards and movie stills in the theater were confiscated, as well as the film reel itself. And although it wasn't censored in the US, that didn't prevent people from getting very, very upset. A writer in Picture Play magazine was not happy, and went on a long, angry diatribe, and here it is. Flaming Youth was produced without regard to law, order, decency, or restraint. Most of the time, it verges on low comedy and burlesque. Honestly, there are moments when you suspect that Warner Fabian was kidding the world when he wrote the novel, and the director must have been kidding Warner Fabian when he transplanted the novel on the screen. The picture should have been dedicated to Saint Vitus. Not only is the cast afflicted with the fidgets, but the story itself wiggles through all sorts of modern immoralities. But the wiggling is so carefully planned for the censors that Flaming Youth will probably be admitted where Anna Christie is banned. Sometimes I wonder what actors and actresses have against society people. Most actors and actresses I know are capable of acting like ladies and gentlemen, at least when the occasion demands. And most of them have pleasant and agreeable manners. But put them on a set and tell them they are going to be society folks, and bluey, they start giving imitations of the annual dance of the Waiters Club. Colleen Moore plays the Fabian Flapper for low comedy. Even her makeup was intended to be funny, because she manages to look like Gail Henry in a too-real burlesque. But she knows her comedy stuff, and she knows how to be pathetic. And so, as the saying goes, she gets away with the part. And while not having any real power, a meeting of women's club leaders in Madison, Wisconsin declared the movie a menace to public morals. And I couldn't find a review of Flaming Youth in Variety, which I guess makes sense. From what I've seen, it was often a very conservative publication then, so it wouldn't be surprising if it just refused to publish a review of it. But it did publish a couple of articles on the Canada ban. For others, the film was one of the most exciting things on the screen in years. Motion Picture News wrote, "If ever there was a film play that was in style, this is it. They're all crying for entertainment like this. Lots of pep, moments that border on the gasping point, jazz, a snappy story, pretty women, dashing heroes, gorgeous settings, and for good measure, a thrill ever and anon. Flaming Youth is a distinctly high-class, entertaining picture, and will send away everyone who sees it thoroughly satisfied, and will start the gray matter working in heads of many to whom the story will strike home with much force." Exhibitor's trade review heaped on slightly poetic praise. Perhaps college professors will call it trashy, but the people who should be pleased, those who pack the movie houses every night. They are going to go crazy about it, because it flames with youth, it burns with love, and it scintillates with interest. It is like a drink of champagne. It opens up a new sparkling world, alive with beautiful women, handsome men, and homes so luxurious that they are like palaces. It was a movie tailor-made for young adults, with an atmosphere and pace that matched the breakneck speed of the younger set. It was described by the Times Square Daily as a picture that was snappy, fast, and full of sexy stuff. Stripping away the moral crisis bias from a number of reviews, one common objective criticism was that the film could have used some cutting. The magazine Screen Opinions, which claimed that it provided unbiased reviews, said of the length of the movie, "It is considerably too long, and will be improved when a few hundred feet are eliminated from the latter half, including some of the kissing scenes." There was also a bit of a debate over whether young jazzy people were portrayed accurately or in a more sensationalistic way. With any Hollywood movie, especially from that time, it's pretty likely that there was some degree of exaggeration. Some reviewers, though they were in the minority, thought that the movie wasn't edgy enough. Despite the cries about a moral panic, the New York Sun wrote that, "The story isn't half as hot as it sounds." Motion Picture News wrote something similar. It said, "A lot of folks will expect to see some sensational scenes similar to those described in the book, but they'll be disappointed." Seeing comments like that kinda makes me want to read the book. And as some of you may have noticed earlier in the video, the main buzzword for Flaming Youth was jazz. It comes up again and again in reviews. This might sound like a weird way to describe a silent film, but jazz was not just a genre of music. It was a philosophy for life, in the same way that Dada was more than just an art style. Jazz was fast, carefree, and left plenty of room for improvisation. And that's exactly how an increasing number of young people wanted to live their lives. Many of the people who liked the movie advised that it wasn't just senseless sin, there was a positive message within. Exhibitor's Trade Review put it nicely when it said that, "The lesson is administered in a sugar-coated pill of laughter, gaiety, and jazz." But to see this message, many reviewers thought, you had to set aside your bias. Maybe some people wouldn't have liked how the message was conveyed, but agreed with it in general. Going back to the plot, Pat enjoyed doing petting and cuddling, but when there was an opportunity to give herself completely to that violinist on the yacht, she resolutely would not, and wouldn't allow her virtue to be taken from her unwillingly, and she chose instead to literally jump ship. The overall message of the movie was a bit of a compromise between the conservative and progressive elements in society. Pat was able to enjoy herself by pushing through some of the older boundaries, but ultimately she chose to save herself for marriage. Though plenty of stubborn people didn't want to accept a compromise. Industry people knew Flaming Youth would probably be a box office smash, and would do so effortlessly. The movie targeted a very enthusiastic demographic. It featured tantalizing things for curious men and women, and could capitalize on the popularity of the book, which had only been published earlier that same year, so the timing was still very up to date, and had been made even before the fast-moving jazzy youth moved on to the next big thing. The Film Daily, speaking to movie exhibitors, said, "Count on your flapper delegation to advertise the showing for you. They'll whisper about the book being naughty, it will be passed around, and there will be a mob on hand." And Exhibitor's Trade Review advised using reverse psychology. It told exhibitors, "The best way to arouse the interest of the curious is to condemn the picture. There is here a peculiar psychology which makes people impatient to see what they have been told not to. Here is your cue for exploitation. They will come hot-footing it to your theater. Inflame the minister with the outrages against society on the part of the younger generation, and get him to preach a sermon on the subject, using the picture to illustrate his point." As I said at the beginning, Flaming Youth did a lot to put the flapper revolution into high gear, and flapper roles became the new thing in Hollywood. Photoplay magazine joked about the popularity of Flaming Youth, and how it almost immediately spawned a wave of copycats. First, Flaming Youth. It was a hit. So along comes its poor relatives, Flaming Barriers and Flaming Passion. That last is a hot one. They'll need non-flammable film. We'll probably see Flaming Souls and Flaming Sin next. And then the idiot film company will offer a prize for the best title containing the word flaming. That ought to burn it up. For many, another major highlight of the movie, aside from the general feel, was Colleen Moore. She completely stole the show as the main flapper protagonist. Motion Picture News wrote that, "It is a difficult thing in commenting on this picture to keep from waxing overenthusiastic on the work of Colleen Moore, who as Patricia Fentress eclipses all her former characterizations and paints a portrait of that modern institution, the flapper, that is without parallel in screen history. We doff our hat to Miss Moore and feel sure that the nation's picture fans will soon be discussing nothing else but her chef-d'oeuvre." Exhibitor's Trade Review made an accurate prediction when it said, "Colleen Moore will without doubt become one of the leading stars of the day as a result of this picture. She is vivacious, light-hearted, gay. She is the young flapper to the very tip of her bobbed head." The reviewer for the New York Tribune wasn't a big fan of the movie itself, but was very enthusiastic about Moore. They wrote, "There is just one thing in this picture that flames. This is Colleen Moore. We have become a complete convert, and realize now that Miss Moore is one of the actively fascinating young women on the screen." The New York American had a similar opinion about the movie in general and Moore. It said, "This little lady was so adorable, so picturesque, so cutely pantomimic, so multicolored in her emotions, and so splendidly eyed that she was quite enough to make a go even of a devitalized book picture." It's not an exaggeration to say that Flaming Youth made Colleen Moore's career skyrocket, and she quickly became an extremely relevant pop culture figure, and one of the most famous actresses in Hollywood in the 1920s. So, the overall quality of the movie is a bit tricky to judge because there were so many biased opinions, both for and against it. But the impression I get is that the movie, objectively speaking, was fairly average, or maybe a little bit above average. But depending on what you wanted from movies, it could prove very exciting and titillating. It was most definitely hip and cool for the younger crowd, and Colleen Moore made up significantly for any of the movie's flaws with her glowing breakthrough performance. In retrospect, Flaming Youth definitely gets an A+ for cultural influence. And you might say that, more than any other movie of the decade, it best captured the zeitgeist of a generation. Even perhaps the leading authority of the Jazz Age, F. Scott Fitzgerald, recognized this when he said, "I was the spark that lit up Flaming Youth, and Colleen Moore was the torch." One of the biggest celebrities in 1920s America was the Sultan of Swat, the Bambino himself, Babe Ruth. And he actually tried his hand at acting, appearing in a 1927 comedy drama called Babe Comes Home, about a baseball player named Babe Dugan. This was the same year Ruth famously broke the all-time single-season home run record, and had a friendly home run competition with his teammate Lou Gehrig throughout the season. The same year, the New York Yankees won 110 games, which is tied for 5th place in the all-time record list. And the same year, the Yankees had its famous Murderers Row batting lineup that punished opposing pitchers. This was a year when Babe Ruth was in his prime. But this actually wasn't the first time Ruth had tried acting. He appeared in an independent movie called Headin' Home 7 years before. But that wasn't really a Hollywood movie, and it was released in 1920, when Ruth had certainly caught a lot of people's attention, but hadn't yet achieved the godlike status that he would shortly thereafter. In Babe Comes Home, he starred with Anna Q. Nilsson as his leading lady, a pretty big name at the time despite being forgotten today. And it was based on a short story by the obscure author Gerald Beaumont called Said with Soap. So, what was the movie actually about? The story wasn't too complicated, and here's a quick summary I put together. The leading lady, Vernie, played by Nilsson, works at a laundry in Los Angeles with 2 other characters, played by Louise Fazenda and Arthur Stone, who provide comic relief throughout the movie. Vernie has to wash a baseball team's uniforms every week, and the player Babe Dugan always has the dirtiest one, stained with a mix of dirt and tobacco juice.
Verney writes to him anonymously to scold him for his dirty habits. Somehow, this turns into a relationship and then a marriage. They're a happy couple at first, and there are some scenes of them at an amusement park together and looking over their new married home. But they start going through a rough patch, one of the biggest, or perhaps the only reason, being Babe's chewing tobacco habit. The two separate, and Babe resumes his work as a professional baseball player. At the climax of the movie, Babe and his team, the Angels, are competing against another team in an important game, with the league pennant on the line. But there's one problem. Babe's lack of chewing tobacco negatively affects his game, and he can't hit as well as before. It gets to the 9th inning, and chances are running out. Babe will soon take his turn at the plate. Verney comes running from the bleachers to hand him a plug of chewing tobacco, which enables him to hit the winning home run. As a little side note, I think it's interesting that the character Babe Dugan played for the Angels in Los Angeles. Now, this wasn't the same as the current Major League Baseball team, but it was actually a real team in the Pacific Coast League, which was in the minor leagues. Anyway, Ruth seemed surprisingly committed to the part. His schedule was tight, considering he would have to start training soon for the next season across the country in New York, so filming time was pretty limited. And here's a little anecdote I found that, if true, gives a glimpse into the great Bambino's dedication for becoming a potential movie star. As an illustration of how serious Ruth took his job before the camera, director Ted Wilde told us about one of the days when he was rehearsing the Bambino for a thrilling hook slide to the home plate. Ruth on this occasion tried the hook 5 times without meeting with this director's approbation. I said to him, Wilde quoted himself, "Try it just once more and we will shoot it." Ruth did, but this time went in on his left side. Asking him what the big idea was caused him to take me to his dressing room. There, he showed me that a layer of skin had been rubbed off the right side by the rehearsals. To double down on the novelty of having Babe Ruth as a leading man, the film was released using a short-lived sound-on-film process called Vocafilm. Little information is known about this, but it's assumed that there was music and sound effects that played with the film. Babe Comes Home was released by First National Pictures, which was a pretty big movie studio at that time. They put a lot of effort into advertising the movie, imagining tie-ins targeting baseball fans and expecting, at the very least, that the millions of baseball fans in the US would go see the movie. I mean, it featured Babe Ruth, the biggest name in baseball, maybe the biggest name in all sports. That was a pretty fair expectation from the studio, wouldn't you think? As surprising as it might sound, Babe Comes Home performed very poorly at the box office, and was regarded as a flop. It seemed to be an advertiser's dream, but for some reason or another, it just didn't catch on. Maybe we'll get some kind of indication of why that was from some reviews from movie critics. I couldn't find a review that really panned the movie, though I'm sure there's one out there somewhere. Some reviewers were very enthusiastic, and some were more mixed. Take, for example, this excerpt talking about the kind of humor in the movie. Not so bad despite its tobacco-chewing fun by Babe, for those who like that kind of backyard comedy. But the picture will get hearty laughs from the character of picture audiences preferring westerns. So maybe the humor was a bit earthy, but there were plenty of people who would have enjoyed that kind of humor, as that last reviewer implied, so that probably wasn't the main reason for the movie's lack of success. So was it Babe Ruth's acting ability? I mean, he wasn't a professional, but had it been that bad? Well, no. Quite a few publications actually praised Ruth's performance, though it's hard to tell if they're just complimenting him because they feel like they had to show him some respect since he was a larger-than-life figure. For example, here's one reviewer's praise of Babe Ruth's acting ability. His good-humored, never-quite-grown-up personality radiates out of Babe Comes Home. The lad is a screen bet, and no mistake. And he can act, don't let anyone tell you different. Without effort, he is humorous and he is touching. Babe Comes Home isn't much of a comedy, and it is dreadfully padded, but Babe makes it a 6 best. Another reviewer who had attended the preview of the movie before its official public premiere also had some pretty nice things to say, though not exactly raving. A satisfied audience wended its way from the Westlake Theater following the preview of Babe Comes Home, starring Babe Ruth. The Babe proved a pleasant surprise as an actor, and the picture is far above the usual hokum featuring stars of the sporting world, whose only qualification for a screen role is the position they maintain in the said world. Ruth does not try to act accordingly to the dictates of our best dramatic schools, which is probably the one reason why the picture provides pleasant entertainment. He depends on a naturalness for which he is typical in private life, and made no attempt to show up John Barrymore, Jack Gilbert, or other of our well-known thespians of the screen. One of the few criticisms that I could find was that it lost some of its momentum in the middle. Midweek Pictorial wrote, "The weak part of the picture comes in the middle. There are scenes in an amusement park which are very funny for a while, and then grow tiresome. And there are other scenes showing Babe and Vernie looking over the little house which is to be their home after they are married. This part also needs cutting." But this was a pretty minor thing, so it seems we'll have to look elsewhere for a reason why the movie bombed. In an article for Photoplay magazine, sprinter Charlie Paddock wrote about why athletes fail in the movies. His conclusion can be summed up with one comment he made about Gertrude Ederle, the first woman to swim across the English Channel. The public was interested in Gertrude Ederle the swimmer, and not in Gertrude Ederle the actress. But really, we can replace the name Gertrude Ederle with any other athlete's name. And this is probably the simplest explanation of all. In that same article, Paddock mentions a plethora of other athletes who gave movies a try in the 1920s. Jack Dempsey, Gene Tunney, Red Grange, Duke Kahanamoku, Bill Tidden, Johnny Weissmuller, Benny Leonard, and of course, Babe Ruth. All had tried, but all had failed. There were also other kinds of celebrities from outside of movies that tried as well, like opera stars and other singers. But because we're still talking about the silent era, their talent could not translate over. It's the same reason why no one wanted to watch, say, Clara Bow pursue pro tennis, or Richard Dix pitch in a baseball game. At least, not after the novelty of it wore off. They weren't athletes, they were actors. Just how the athletes weren't actors. So even if Babe Ruth had been a decent actor, audiences had seen so many athletes before him fail to make a good impression on the screen, so why would they have any reason to think that he would have done any differently? So that's the story of Babe Comes Home. It's disappointing that we'll probably never get to see for ourselves Babe Ruth acting in a real Hollywood movie, and in the same year that he broke that home run record and became the biggest pop culture icon aside from Charles Lindbergh. But there's always a chance. One of the most sought-after lost films is Four Devils, which was directed by F.W. Murnau, the same director who made such famous films as Nosferatu and Sunrise: A Song of Two Humans. The story was based on an 1890 novel by Herman Bang. This film is a bit different from many of the other lost films I've talked about, because it was an artistic endeavor rather than just a Hollywood movie made strictly for entertainment. And because it was directed by Murnau, one of the greatest directors of his generation, it is currently one of the most sought-after lost films of all time. Sunrise had been Murnau's first Hollywood film, and it was a critical and artistic triumph. At that time, most big Hollywood studios permitted one of their top artistic directors to make a prestige film, which was a film that was intended to give a studio a reputation for making film as art and increase its prestige, rather than be a big moneymaker. So, after many good critical reviews of Sunrise, a lot of cinephiles were anxiously waiting to see what Murnau would do next. Four Devils was set in a circus, and also had Janet Gaynor playing one of the main characters. The film was divided into two main parts. The first part showed four orphaned children, 2 boys and 2 girls, who are abused by a circus owner. An older clown saves them from his clutches and beats him up. This kindly old clown lovingly raises the children, and they become an acrobatic circus act in Paris called the Four Devils. They earn enough money to allow their adoptive father to retire comfortably. 2 of the 4 devils end up getting engaged at some point. As for the other 2, the main female lead, Marion, played by Janet Gaynor, loves Charles, the other orphan boy. Charles promises to marry Marion, but he falls under the spell of a vamp character, played by Mary Duncan. One scene specifically described in multiple reviews talk of the vamp attending the circus show every night, sitting in a seat that Charles swings very close to during the performance, and was described as a fine piece of suggestion. And Marion can't help but pick the vamp out of the crowd during every show. Another especially praised part of the film were the scenes of the circus performance itself, the beginning of which was described by one reviewer like this. In flowing devilish raps, they ride into the ring, each on a white horse, with the clowns preceding them. Their trapezes are lowered. As each of the quartet rides under it, they are taken aloft, their wraps falling off on the way up to the aerial pedestals of the casting turn. Somehow, Charles's affair with the vamp drains his vitality, and his performance suffers. He goes on even though he's in no condition to perform his signature leap of death. After a very suspenseful scene, he safely completes his performance. But his condition worsens due to his relationship with the vamp, which negatively affects Marion as well. Before the final performance of the film, Charles breaks it off with the vamp, though Marion is unaware of this when the performance begins. There were multiple endings filmed, but at the official premiere of Four Devils, this is the ending that was shown. Marion, gravely upset at Charles getting closer with the vamp, consciously lets go of her trapeze during the act and falls, though survives, barely. However, in Murnau's original ending, which was shown at previews, both Marion and Charles fall to their deaths in the climactic scene. One man's comment from a preview with Murnau's original tragic ending said, "Four Devils is one of the greatest, if not the greatest motion picture that I have ever seen." The man specifically praised the original ending, saying, "For God's sake, don't change the end of the picture." It's unclear how involved Murnau was in reshooting the ending, if he was even involved at all, given that he was very particular about how his films were made, and was not one for compromise when it came to his vision. But either way, the film would be changed once more, this time to its even more severe detriment. Four Devils was first released in October 1928, which was right in the transition period between silence and talkies. And Fox, the studio behind Four Devils, was one of the studios that tried to get in on talkies right at the start. On its original release, it included a synchronized musical score and sound effects, similar to what had been done with Murnau's previous film, Sunrise. But the transition rapidly accelerated, and now the new novelty was synchronized spoken dialogue. So some scenes that included this were tacked on, and the film was re-released. But by that point, Murnau was no longer working at Fox and had no input in the matter. The new additions were disastrous. Other late silent films had the same treatment, but this was especially grievous when done to a film that was trying to be a serious artistic endeavor. The new dialogue was, in one contemporary reviewer's opinion, stupid, out of place, and destructive rather than an aid. From the moment the players began uttering absurd lines in the latter sequences, the picture fell to pieces, and the tragedy happens to the picture, not within it. This re-released version was mostly advertised as a novelty because it was Janet Gaynor's talkie debut, a far cry from what the film was originally intended to be. Murnau's original film had been picked apart for the sake of money. The original ending certainly seemed more befitting of a tragedy, but not just because there's more death. If both Marion and Charles died, it shows how Charles's bad decisions not only dragged him down, but also dragged down Marion with him, despite the fact that she hadn't made any bad decisions herself. Her love for him would end up punishing her. But for the time, maybe that was just too out there for a mainstream American audience to handle. One reviewer who was aware of the different endings illustrated this with their statement, "But could the lovely Janet be permitted to die? Hardly." The public might have resented one of their new favorite screen idols being killed off in a movie. It seems very clear that the business side of Hollywood really put a damper on Murnau's vision, and ultimately had a negative effect on the quality of the film. Here's a random little tidbit I came across during my research. Murnau, always an experimenter, utilized a contraption that made it possible to film acrobats in action in a more artistic way. This thing was called a Go Devil, and Picture Play magazine described it like this. "It is a new device that moves the camera about in a very animated way while a scene is being photographed. The device looks somewhat like a steam shovel. It swings the camera about and lifts it up and down with an amazing rapidity. It is being used to photograph trapeze performers in action, and its gyrations are so swift that it can follow through the air without missing anything." And here are just some other random notes about Four Devils that I found through looking at movie magazines from that time. There were a lot of positive comments about Mary Duncan, who played the vamp. Many reviews said that she was the highlight among the main cast, despite the fact that, by all accounts, her technique was a very outdated and exaggerated way of portraying a vamp. One reviewer went so far as to say that she overshadowed Janet Gaynor and the rest of the cast. But another account from the Exhibitor's Herald said that, "Apparently all were agreed, however, that Mary Duncan was called upon to give such an extraordinarily unbelievable performance as a vamp of the old school that the entire picture suffered." Janet Gaynor was a darling of the movie magazines, fans, and critics alike, but many reviewers thought that she wasn't used to her full ability in Four Devils, and that any criticism of her performance should not be placed on her. The performance of Anders Randolph, who played the abusive circus owner, was singled out by some as being the most animated of the cast, despite having a rather minor role. Some critics also said that the pacing of the film was too slow, especially at the beginning, something which was pretty common for artistic films back then, and really it's the same even nowadays. The actors portraying the Four Devils had to undergo intensive acrobatic training for their roles. Actress Nancy Drexel was quoted as saying of the experience, "It's really a lot of fun, more fun than I've had in a picture in a long while. And I'll be sorry when the picture's over and we can't do our trapeze exercises anymore." Just as a demonstration of how big of an event movie premieres could be at that time, at the premiere of Four Devils at the Gaiety Theater in New York, opening night tickets were $5.50 for orchestra seats, which would be $100 today, and $3 for balcony seats, which would be $55 today. It seems that the last known copy of the film had been in the possession of actress Mary Duncan, but there was no trace of it after that, though it's possible it might still be part of her estate. Four Devils continues to be one of the most sought-after lost films, mostly because it was a serious effort by Murnau, who made other films now regarded as masterpieces. Although reviews for the film were kind of mixed, at least from what I was able to find, films with a more artistic bent are sometimes misunderstood by many people in their time, but age very well years or decades later, before eventually achieving a godlike status. Though in this case, I feel like the mixed reception was almost definitely caused in large part by studio tampering. After all, this kind of thing has happened many times before. I'm certain that I'm not alone when I say that I think keeping the original tragic ending would really help the film stand out more and improve its reputation if it were still in existence. At that time, very few Hollywood movies had unhappy endings, certainly not as sad as the two main characters dying. But Murnau never strove to make strictly entertainment. Though if the film is found, that print would probably have the alternate happy ending, since that's what was released publicly and distributed. Was Four Devils a masterpiece of silent film, or was it simply an above-average Hollywood movie in terms of production, with noticeable flaws in its story and execution? Let's all hope that someday we'll know for sure. The next movie I'm going to talk about is The American Venus, released in 1926. Louise Brooks fans will probably recognize that title because it was her first substantial film role, but we'll talk more about that later. And a short disclaimer, the trailer for this movie has survived, so the video footage you'll see later on is in fact real footage from The American Venus. Alright, first a little background. The movie featured Fay Lamphere, a completely forgotten name now, and one that barely registered even then. She was the winner of the 1925 Miss America pageant, which featured bathing beauty types of young women popularized by Mack Sennett in the previous decade. Appropriately, the movie is about a beauty pageant. Shortly after the 1925 Miss America pageant had finished, the New York Evening Graphic alleged that the pageant had been rigged in favor of Fay Lamphere. But the Graphic was a tabloid paper, so the credibility for its allegation is pretty low. It did, however, provide some possible publicity for The American Venus, though filming for it hadn't started yet. In the movie, Fay Lamphere played a beauty pageant participant, Miss Alabama, who was more of a minor character, but serves an important purpose at the end. Esther Ralston played the main character, and Louise Brooks played another pageant participant, Miss Bayport, who didn't seem to have a big purpose in the story, at least not from what I could find. Despite most reviews saying that the story was weak, some magazines wrote surprisingly detailed summaries of it. Some details are included in some, and others include different details, so I synthesized them into the most detailed narrative I could. And here it goes. The main character is a young woman named Mary Gray who lives out west. Her father, John Gray, owns a cold cream business. He's in fierce competition with another man named Hugo Niles. Hugo's son, Horace, is engaged to Mary. Horace is described unflatteringly as pasty-souled. Because of the engagement of his son to John Gray's daughter, Hugo, who has the bigger company, chooses not to put John out of business. There's also a young publicity man for the Niles company named Chip Armstrong, who suggests that Hugo enter a girl into the famous Atlantic City beauty pageant, so that if she won, she could provide good national publicity for his product by citing it as the reason for her beauty. Hugo turns him down because he thinks his wife wouldn't approve of it. Chip sees that Mary Gray is very beautiful, so he defects to John Gray's company and gets Mary to enter into the pageant and becomes her publicity manager. Chip and Mary fall in love, and Mary breaks off her engagement with Horace. As the pageant progresses, it looks as though Mary will win, but now, with nothing holding him back from crushing John Gray's cold cream business, Hugo hatches a plot to sabotage Mary's chances in the pageant. Somehow, he passes on to Mary the lie that her father has been in a terrible accident back out west. Mary and Chip abandon the pageant and try to rush over to him. One way or another, they find out that it was a lie, and they try to rush back over to Atlantic City, unsure if they can make it back in time. They race there recklessly and dangerously in an automobile, and somehow manage to not get injured, but ultimately, they don't make it back to the pageant in time. With Mary now disqualified for not participating in the final part of the pageant, another winner is selected, Miss Alabama, who Mary had become friends with in the course of the pageant. But to Mary's joy, Miss Alabama tells the reporters that she owes her beauty to Grey's cold cream and saves the day. So that was the story. I also want to mention that there were some Technicolor sequences as another novelty. One review described these sequences in a bit more detail and mentioned that they included scenes on the boardwalk, in tableau, and in a fashion review. The tableau refers to tableaux vivants, which were like stationary scenes, often with elaborate and revealing costumes and interesting backdrops. Fortunately, I was able to find an example of one of these that was featured in The American Venus, and here it is. The full movie had a runtime between 70 and 80 minutes, and because the beauty element was focused on so much in the advertising and reviews, I imagine that the pageant scenes took up a big percentage of that. With many commenting on a weak story, perhaps the pageant scenes made up about half of the movie, maybe a little less, but that's just a guess. It's now a highly sought-after lost film for Louise Brooks fans, but how did it fare upon its release? Critically, the reviews were a bit mixed. Nearly every review I found mentions that the plot was thin, though for many of them, this wasn't fatal. Movie magazines were more positive, maybe because they were in the business of advertising female beauty to the public, and this couldn't have fit the bill more. Trade magazines tended to focus on the fact that the movie basically advertised for itself, and they seemed to expect at least modest profits with it. Variety was a bit more critical. The official review stated that the picture itself is an in-betweener, with a few laughs and no real dry spots, but on the other hand, no really hilarious moments. Just lots of female flesh and silk bathing suit beauties, all dressed so that the maximum of sex appeal will be reflected on the screen. In a far more conservative assessment in that same issue of Variety, the writer of an opinion piece could not get over the risque images it presented. They complained, "The American Venus, released by famous players Lasky this week, is solely an attempt to make money through a display of women as nearly naked as they dare to show them. Silk bathing suits are used throughout under the pretext of displaying perfect forms selected by the Atlantic City judges of the last beauty contest. Brassieres have been discarded. To make the epidermis more luring, much of it is shown close-up in natural colors." And to that I say, of course the goal was to make money. That was, and still is, the goal of the movie industry. And it was following whatever it thought would make money, and feminine beauty was, like in many decades, popular in the 1920s. I'm guessing that this article was written by one of the aging reformers from the Progressive era who were constantly lampooned by the younger set of the 1920s. It was exactly this sort of writer that the Exhibitor's Herald had in mind when it wrote in its review of The American Venus, "The scantiness of the girl's attire, though by no means vulgar, will undoubtedly offend the bigoted." But perhaps the most negative review I could find was a short one from a newspaper that said, "The American Venus is unmitigated ballyhoo, press agent puffery of the least mistakable sort. A sort of bench-made boob-catcher, dedicated to readers of tabloid dailies, and festooned with symbolic dollar signs." One common observation that many reviewers made was that Fay Lamphere didn't have much photographic beauty. Despite the fact that she had won a national beauty pageant, photographic beauty was another thing entirely, and she seemed to have no future in the movie industry. Another failed experiment. I think this can be compared to Babe Ruth and other athletes not being able to really break into Hollywood. Louise Brooks, on the other hand, was a welcome newcomer. She had previously made one film appearance before The American Venus, but it was only a small, uncredited extra part, so she was a complete unknown in movies. Her very appealing physical beauty was used to great advantage, and seemed to be a highlight of the movie for some. Picture Play magazine even went so far as to say, "Louise is the young lady with the black hair who saved the American Venus from a fate worse than death." Reviewers wrote few details other than simply complimenting her looks, and that might have been her character's only real purpose. But how did the American Venus fare with the public? Good, but not great. I did find one blurb citing a very profitable week for it at one big theater, but there were many more smaller theaters recording relatively smaller returns. In one piece of data collected from some exhibitors, the American Venus tally showed 3 reports of 2 out of 4 points, 19 reports of 3 out of 4 points, and 2 reports of 4 out of 4 points, with an average value of 69 out of 100%. While this sample size is obviously very small, there was clearly a general consensus that it fared okay in terms of attendance. Comparing it to the other films released around the same time, it was about average. Maybe it's a bit difficult for some to understand why it wasn't a bigger movie. To many of us 1920s nerds, it might seem to be a dream come true. Beautiful 1920s women in skimpy bathing suits, sometimes even in Technicolor. It would certainly be good B-roll footage for this channel. But keep in mind that there was a part of the adult population who simply didn't approve of this kind of epidermis exposure, and wouldn't have been interested in seeing it. And it should also be noted that beautiful women were nothing new in the movie industry of the 1920s, and it was often oversaturated with them. Despite being too scandalous for some, for others, the American Venus wasn't modern enough. The review in the movie magazine Picture Play said the concept of the movie was outdated, and elaborated more along these lines, possibly giving another hint about why the movie wasn't super successful. The American Venus is a throwback to the old Cecil DeMille days, when a pretty leg or a one-piece bathing suit held the popular attention. It is as gaudy as a Christmas tree, without nearly so much interest. In fact, as one scene after another, crammed with girls in various stages of attire, passed before me, I thought the world had turned back 10 years. This terrific setback to the industry must have cost lots and lots of money, taken a long time to make, and kept many dressmakers busy sewing for months. And yet, it's all just a big mistake. Perhaps there just wasn't enough to make it stand out from other beauty-focused movies. If it had been made a year or two later, when Louise Brooks was at the height of her relevance in Hollywood, and given a more engaging story, perhaps it would have done better. The bathing beauty trend had been around for over a decade by the time the American Venus was released. The original Miss America pageant in Atlantic City had its origins in 1921, and was discontinued for a number of years after the 1927 pageant, the year after the American Venus came out, which could definitely be a sign that interest had flagged by that point. And remember that pop culture things like this came and went very rapidly in the 1920s, so this wouldn't be surprising at all. And while the American Venus didn't launch Louise Brooks into stardom, it at least introduced her to many people. And that's the main legacy of the movie now. By the early 1920s, Hollywood had become fully entrenched in mainstream culture, with many die-hard fans who knew movies and movie stars like the back of their hand. Hollywood had successfully built a cult of sorts surrounding its movies and industry. And it loved depicting movie stars living glamorously, and giving average people a glimpse into their totally real and definitely not staged private lives. But it also liked to stress that becoming a movie star wasn't easy, and breaking into the movies was about as likely, or even less so, than winning the lottery. Stories about average people trying to break into the movies abounded on film and in print in the various movie magazines. The early 1920s also saw a rise in Hollywood looking in at itself and making self-deprecatory jokes. And the 1923 movie Hollywood combined both of these elements. But it pulled off something with far more novelty value than other movies like it. It featured cameos from more than 50 movie stars. Most of the biggest stars of the day made an appearance, including Charlie Chaplin, Bebe Daniels, Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, Baby Peggy, William S. Hart, Thomas Meighan, Pola Negri, and Will Rogers. It also featured Wallace Reed's last film appearance, and was released 6 months after his premature death. But the most interesting cameo is from Fatty Arbuckle, nearly 2 years after a scandal ruined his career and reputation. Almost definitely intended as a very dark joke, his appearance featured him as an out-of-work actor applying for a job at a studio, but the casting director's window is closed to him. Of this cameo, one reviewer wrote, "When Mr. Arbuckle turned his face around and was recognized by the audience, there was an outburst of hearty applause which lasted as long as he was on the screen. Whether this was an unusual occurrence or whether it happens at every performance, we do not know." Thomas Meighan was another featured cameo, and I found a pretty long description of his appearance, which I'll quote here. "Thomas Meighan will be seen in his favorite pose. He is shown in the picture with 12 little children getting ready to go on location with his director, Alfred E. Green, and other members of the cast. For his bit in the picture, Meighan stops at the newsstand of the Southern Pacific station in Los Angeles and buys chocolate for all the kiddies. Judging from the smile he wore while making the scene, Tommy had the time of his life with the youngsters. While in the act of buying candy, Meighan stops long enough to greet Hope Hampton, Gertrude Astor, Lila Lee, and Will Rogers, and write directions for the girl in the picture to find her way to Hollywood. The main female character also meets Mary Pickford when she delivers a dress to her, and Mary calls out for Douglas Fairbanks to meet the girl, which he does. Hollywood also featured some non-acting luminaries from the movie industry, including Sid Grauman and Cecil and William DeMille. In fact, in more than one review, Cecil DeMille's acting was praised, though I couldn't find out what the context of his cameo was. With such a unique novelty, the main cast of characters, practically out of necessity, were made up of unknown actors. And because the cameos had to be mostly shoehorned in, the story was pretty weak, though I don't think anyone went into that movie thinking that the story would be anything special. While most of the reviewers' attention was understandably focused on the various cameos, I was able to grab little details from various sources about the plot, and I made my own summary using that information, so here it goes. A young woman named Angela from a small Midwestern town thinks she has what it takes to become a movie star after her friend tells her she can succeed. Angela's family is poor, and her family's home burns down. Her elderly grandmother urges her to pursue her dream, and even sells off the land where the burned-down house was in order to pay for Angela's trip to Hollywood. Angela's grandfather is in poor health, so he accompanies her to Hollywood for a change of air. Almost immediately, the grandfather lands a job from a movie director and gets steady work. He also becomes an honored guest at many movie stars' homes. Angela goes from studio to studio, but gets nowhere, even though she's beautiful. So she has to live off her grandfather's earnings. The grandfather sends money back home so that his wife, the grandmother, can come to Hollywood, and she brings along an old family maid. Again, almost immediately, both get jobs in the movie business by accident. Then the rest of the family move to Hollywood as well. Angela's father, mother, and sister all get jobs at a studio simply because they are the right types. Her father has a perfect nose for a part, and her sister has big feet that apparently help her get a part. Also along comes a young man who wants to marry Angela, so he sells his pants-pressing business to come follow her to Hollywood, and gets a job in westerns. But Angela still can't get a job in Hollywood. She gives up and decides to settle down and get married, presumably to the young man who wanted to marry her. She has twins named Doug and Mary, and even they're able to land jobs in movies. Reviews of the movie seem to have been pretty positive. Nobody expected it to be a piece of high art or anything, but its entertainment value was deemed more than sufficient. And of course, the biggest attraction was the unprecedented number of big names featured in it. The movie clocked in at about an hour and 40 minutes. Considering that the beginning had to set up the light story for, let's say, 20 minutes or so, that leaves an hour and 20 minutes to fit in more than 50 cameos. That's about an average of 1 cameo every minute and a half. It was truly a parade of stars. It did its advertising for itself. An exhibitor's magazine said simply of advertising for the movie, "Promise them a load of laughs, real ones. There shouldn't be any exploitation diagnosis necessary. You know best how to get them in. Do it." As for how much money the movie made, I couldn't find any good figures outside of those for individual first-run theaters. But that same exhibitor's magazine said, "Spells success for the exhibitor. Hollywood should be a cleanup. This is more strictly and more intimately a look into movie land than the others. They'll eat it up. Hollywood will undoubtedly prove one of the biggest moneymakers of the year, unless the dope is way off." There were some negative reviews, though. One reviewer wasn't too harsh when they complained that, "Too bad Hollywood aspired to be a feature picture. What a great newsreel it would have made." A much more strongly worded one came from one West Virginia woman. She said, "I disagreed with all the critics about Hollywood. Of all the silly hodgepodge, that picture was the worst. It was all hokum, and the lead actress, Hope Drown, was too namby-pamby for words. I saw it with a bunch of girls, and only one of them liked the whole picture. Of course, we all liked the glimpses of so many stars, but we'd prefer them in the screen magazines. I really don't believe any girl could be as dumb as Angela was in the picture." As that last one mentioned, though, most critics did like it, and I have to imagine that if I were alive back then, I probably would have enjoyed all the tongue-in-cheek jokes too. So basically, if you didn't expect Hollywood to be an artistic masterpiece, then it sounds like a blast. This was absolutely geared toward the countless Hollywood superfans in the US and elsewhere in the world, who I'm sure would have gone to see this movie multiple times just to make sure they caught every cameo. It seems like it had plenty of inside jokes, and was probably the best of the sort of Hollywood propaganda type of movies. The light commentary that Hollywood the movie made about Hollywood the industry is also a bit interesting. In the July 26, 1923 issue of Variety magazine, one reviewer said, "The story brings out that neither beauty nor youth has first call in the studios, but types are more eagerly accepted, with much more decision in their selection. It's sad that we no longer have this wonderful documentation of 1920s Hollywood not taking itself too seriously. It really sounds like it was one of the greatest movie novelties of the decade." Next up is Human Wreckage from 1923. This requires some background and context. The lead actress was Dorothy Davenport, though for this movie and thereafter, she was known as Mrs. Wallace Reed. If you've watched my Famous Deaths of the 1920s series, then Wallace Reed will be a familiar name. He had been a big heartthrob on movie screens in the late 1910s and early 1920s, but he died tragically on January 18, 1923 at the young age of 31. His health had rapidly declined in the last few years of his life due to a morphine addiction that he had developed after an onset injury in 1919. The circumstances of his death were linked with accusations against Hollywood that it was an immoral and vice-ridden place in need of reform. But Reed wasn't vilified as a junkie, and was mostly seen as an unfortunate victim of addiction. What went largely unreported was that he was pushed to finish filming on movies despite his addiction being known on set, and he was given morphine in order to get it done, thus enabling and worsening his addiction. After Reed's death, his wife, Dorothy, became an outspoken anti-narcotics advocate. Human Wreckage was the product of all of this. While Mrs. Reed didn't write the scenario for the movie, it was clearly based off of her experiences, and she undoubtedly had quite a bit of input into it. It was universally recognized as an anti-drug propaganda film. But the word propaganda didn't necessarily have a negative connotation, as it pretty much always does now, and was used simply as a category. Of course, some people did have a low opinion of that category of films, but overall, Human Wreckage seemed to have a fairly positive response. It was released in June 1923, only about 5 months after Wallace Reed's death. The movie was hyped up quite a bit before its release, especially because of the topic of drugs. Hollywood had just entered its self-censorship phase after a few high-profile controversies. But Mrs. Reed got permission from the head of the censorship board, Will Hayes, to make and release the movie. Under the new rules, drug references were generally prohibited, but Hayes made the exception because the movie had such a strong anti-drug message that he probably figured it would help in the fight to improve Hollywood's reputation. However, in 1924, the year after its American release, it was banned by the British Board of Censors. I was able to find one especially good summary of the plot from the moving picture world, so I'll read that out with some extra details that I added in. Jimmy Brown, a heroin addict, robs a pawn shop and is arrested. His friend, Mary Finnegan, goes to Mrs. Ethel McFarland, played by Mrs. Wallace Reed, who interests her husband, Alan, a celebrated lawyer, played by James Kirkwood, who has Jimmy freed and sent to a cure. Alan McFarland, suffering from overwork, is persuaded by Dr. Hillman to resort to a narcotic, morphine, which gradually gets such a hold on him he cannot shake it off. He even defends Stone, the head of the narcotics ring, in court and has him acquitted. Finally realizing the evil, he goes with his wife to a secluded spot and puts up a strong fight. But it takes the combined power of his family doctor and the belief that his own wife is succumbing to the drug to bring about a cure. Then commences a crusade against the evil, with McFarland heading it. Stone attempts to get away, but meets death when Jimmy drives his taxicab into a locomotive. A lot of reviewers praised Bessie Love's supporting role as a young drug-addicted mother who inadvertently causes her nursing child to become dependent on drugs too. You might be thinking where her character was mentioned in the plot summary. Well, she wasn't. The story with Mr. McFarland was apparently only the main plot, but there were many other subplots, though I couldn't find out how this subplot or any of the others were related to the main characters. The movie also compared drug addiction to hyenas, labeling hyenas as the ugliest animals, and implying that drug addiction is the ugliest of afflictions. At some point in the movie, there was an overexposure of a hyena to drive this symbolism home, though some people thought this particular part was a bit overdone. As I mentioned before, the reviews I found seemed to be mostly positive. The Exhibitor's Trade Review gave it high praise when it said, "If Human Wreckage is not an entertaining picture, certainly it is the greatest of the so-called propaganda films ever produced." Motion Picture News wrote of the movie, "We've had pictures based upon drug addicts and the traffic in the stuff before, but Human Wreckage comes closer to the truth than any of them. No effort has been made here to color a story with sweetness and light. On the contrary, Mrs. Wallace Reed has employed the screen for the purpose of enlightening the world upon one of the greatest evils of human existence." Among the detractors, there were usually two main criticisms. One was that it was bleak and depressing pretty much the entire movie. Unlike many other dramas, there was absolutely no comic relief whatsoever, just sketches of the sad lives of drug addicts. The people who had a problem with this wanted to be entertained, which is what they expected from movies, and that's not what they got. Another criticism was that the movie showcased something inappropriate that the public shouldn't be exposed to. This wasn't really a criticism of the actual quality of the movie, though. The movie magazine Screenland took offense at the film's clear but indirect connection to Wallace Reed when it wrote, It is a debatable point whether or not human wreckage, Mrs. Wally Reed's celluloid attack upon the dope traffic, is a good thing for picturedom. To us, the effect is gruesome. We dislike to have the likable, happy-go-lucky Wally's name linked so grimly in the public's mind to the weakness that killed him. And again, we look upon the theater as a place of entertainment rather than of propaganda. And Variety, which time and time again in this series seems to say mostly negative things, found innumerable problems with human wreckage. But perhaps its strangest take was this. When will the producers of dope pictures have the courage to show the cause of dope to at least 3/4 of its devotees is due to prohibition? There have been dope pictures in plenty. The youngest patron is conversant with the dangers. Now is the opportune moment for pictures to show how narcotics have been substituted for the innocent glass of real beer. While there may be a discussion point in there, in the case of this specific movie, the plot was clearly based on Mrs. Reed's personal experience, which had nothing to do with alcohol or prohibition, so I feel like it misses the point in that way. Both positive and negative reviewers believed that it would perform well at the box office. I couldn't find any statistic for how much it grossed, but it was labeled a successful hit, though not apparently in the top 10 highest-grossing movies of that year. Some might find the advertising for the movie to be a bit distasteful now. It really emphasized Mrs. Wallace Reed in huge capital letters, and because the subject matter was closely related to the tragic death of a beloved movie star, you could argue that despite its well-intentioned message, it comes off as a bit exploitative. While the images that many found to be horrifying and gruesome in Human Wreckage probably wouldn't compare too well with later gritty movies, it might be a fascinating peek into the development of such realism in film. Many reviewers specifically said that it wasn't very sensationalistic, and partly due to that, from everything I've read about it, it would probably be a highlight of the so-called propaganda film genre. There were comments implying that it was a sort of gold standard for that genre. Due to censorship, there were very few films from this time that had direct drug references, no less an entire movie revolving around drugs. So in that way, Human Wreckage is pretty unique. To round off this segment, I'll quickly mention a statement in one review that is painfully ironic considering that Human Wreckage is now a lost film. It said, "Undoubtedly, Human Wreckage will achieve its purpose. It will go ringing down the corridors of time as a monumental warning to generations of the future."
The next movie is The Terror, released in the fall of 1928. The context around this one is interesting. If you're familiar with Hollywood's transition to talkies, you'll know that 1928 was an important year. We usually associate the talkie revolution with The Jazz Singer, which was released in the fall of 1927. But The Jazz Singer wasn't a full-on talkie. For roughly a year, there was this weird in-between transition period from silent movies to talkies. First, there were sound pictures, which were either movies like The Jazz Singer that would have some musical numbers with synchronized sound at various points, or non-musical movies that would have a full synchronized musical backing track, often with sound effects thrown in. The first all-talking movie in Hollywood was the Warner Brothers film Lights of New York, and pretty much everyone agreed that the novelty was pretty cool, but the movie itself was terrible. And this is something that shouldn't be too surprising considering the massive changes that were required to even make it possible. Depending on your definition of a feature film, the 57-minute runtime of Lights of New York may be a tad short of that. But anyway, with that experiment out of the way, Warner Brothers released their second all-talking movie, The Terror, 2 months later. What makes The Terror more interesting for me is that it was a mystery/horror movie with comedy elements. Those wanting to push the talkie revolution forward needed ways to show off the new technology, and something scary actually seems like a pretty clever decision. And by that, I'm mostly talking about sound effects. There were a lot of possibilities for creepy sound effects, and The Terror made use of them. Some examples of these that were listed in reviews were blood-curdling shrieks, whistling wind, and banging doors. But The Terror went above and beyond trying to show off its sound. Instead of having the opening credits simply printed on the screen as usual, a masked figure read them off instead, though it's not much of a wonder why that particular thing never took off. But I've been talking about the background for a long time, so what about the story? It concerns a cast of characters from different backgrounds, including a doctor and his daughter, a spiritualist, a Scotland Yard detective who is undercover as a tipsy golfer, and 2 men recently released from prison. They are all staying at an old inn in the English countryside when spooky things start to happen. They hear creepy organ music coming from somewhere, and they see a black hooded figure prowling around the old building. This mysterious figure is known as the Terror, and he doesn't just want to scare, he also wants to kill. At the end of the movie, he's captured just as he was trying to kill the doctor's daughter, and his true identity is revealed. And that's pretty much it. I won't reveal the Terror's identity because I don't actually know. It's understandable that the reviewers didn't want to give away the climactic reveal, but it makes it very frustrating for me. The story was based on a play, so I guess you could find out who it is if you can find the script, but for the life of me, I couldn't find it anywhere online. Because of its unique place in this important transition period, people had a lot of opinions about the Terror. They were very aware that they were witnessing a massive shakeup that would greatly affect their culture. From what I found, the consensus seemed to be that it was pretty good, or at the very least, much better than The Lights of New York. Motion Picture Magazine said, "This mystery farce provides by far the best comedy entertainment offered on the singing screen." An 18-year-old critic for the magazine The Film Spectator wrote, "Warner Brothers is making no attempt to rest on its laurels. The Terror, their latest all-sound picture, makes Lights of New York look like an amateur attempt." Despite all the negativity spewed off by Variety in this video and previous videos in this series, it actually had a lot of good things to say about The Terror, even if it sometimes came off as a bit backhanded. It said, "Every piece of business is overacted, merely another way of saying that it clicks heavily on all counts. This is a mystery thriller on a par with anything of the kind ever produced, but far more effective than any silent picture owing to the sound." The Film Daily called it the best of talking pictures so far made. Of course, that comes with the caveat that there hadn't been many talkies made by that point. The reviews were not entirely positive, but nearly all recognized The Terror as an important step in the massive transition to talkies, regardless of its quality. Many commented that the silent version was far less effective, and would probably rate as an average to below average movie without sound. Among the criticisms was that the pacing was too slow. A writer for Picture Play magazine said, "The Terror is much too slow to realize its ultimate chills and thrills. This is because the exigencies of the recording process demand that dialogue be carried on while the players remain stationary. Consequently, there are long sequences that resemble a stage play more than a movie. Thus, the story is slow-moving and, to me at least, tiresome." The Film Spectator blamed this on the novelty aspect of the movie when it wrote, "The characters talk with unnatural slowness, which makes the story drag." The Film Daily agreed, writing, "The dialogue slows up the action and results in a picture which has some noticeably prominent slack spots. What you really have is not a motion picture as pictures are known, but a stage play on the screen, with shadow players instead of the real thing." It's not surprising that The Terror wasn't a perfect movie. It was inevitable that there would be technical issues, some of which were things that might not have been anticipated at first. For example, a writer for the Film Spectator in an editorial article about the ongoing transition to sound wrote that, "In The Terror, people stand in the middle of a room and talk. We hear every word distinctly. They run up a stairway that is devoid of carpet, and we do not hear it. He advances a few feet and whispers, and we hear the whisper. Such things as these are among the problems that must be solved quickly, for they are too obvious to escape the alert mind of the public. Another problem was something that couldn't be helped, an immovable camera. One of the biggest problems with early talkies was that cameras had to be much more stationary than before due to the new sound equipment, but nobody held this against the Terror specifically. And then there was the problem of how to use actors in a new way to fit talkies. You've probably all heard about how some actors' voices weren't good enough and it ruined their careers, but there were other problems as well. You couldn't just take stage actors and simply have them act in the same way in an early talkie. As we heard before from one of the criticisms, the actors talked very slowly and negatively affected the movie's pace. This was because the recording quality wasn't that great, so they had to speak extra clearly and extra loudly, but not too loudly. S sounds were especially tricky to enunciate just enough. If words were spoken too quickly, they might just muddle together, and an actor couldn't move around much because the microphone's range wasn't very good. It was a delicate balance. A stage actor would have to adjust a lot of things that they had been doing for years, but the Terror didn't really utilize stage actors like some of the other studios were doing, which presented different problems. Stage actors were more likely to already have good voices for speaking roles, but this had never been an important feature for silent film actors. As long as they could act with their face and body, they hadn't needed to act with their voice. One of the actresses in The Terror, Mae McAvoy, had experienced this firsthand. Some reviewers commented that her voice had not been satisfactory in a previous part talkie she had been in, but had improved a lot in The Terror, so at least she was lucky in that regard. But just imagine how difficult it was to simultaneously have to quickly learn how to act with your voice while having to speak in a strange new way to match the new technology, knowing that everyone at that time would scrutinize every aspect of your vocal performance. Because of its important place in the history of Hollywood, The Terror has jumped high up on my list of lost 1920s films that I want to see. While there are enough surviving talkies from this period to see the transition, The Terror is an important missing piece. You might even call it a turning point in this period of growing pains. And I just want to throw it out there that the soundtrack discs have apparently survived and are in the UCLA archive. Because The Terror was a Vitaphone movie, the sound was recorded onto discs that would be played simultaneously with the film. So I guess it's a lost film with an asterisk, but it's a silver lining of sorts. This seems like a pretty common thing that only the discs survived from early Vitaphone talkies from what I saw online, but it doesn't seem like there are digitized versions for us to listen to. But anyway, that was The Terror, and I'd say it's one of the biggest gems I've found out about so far.
Okay, so the next movie I want to talk about is probably one that many of you haven't heard of, unless you've watched my original video about it. But its story and background were fascinating to me, and I was able to find some good information about it. It's titled Wine, and is immediately intriguing because it was Clara Bow's first starring role back in 1924. Practically everyone interested in the 1920s knows and loves Clara Bow for her influence on American pop culture in the Jazz Age. But Wine also contained so many other things that we now consider quintessentially 1920s. It had illegal booze, flappers, and crazy jazz parties. What more could you want from a 1920s movie? Even in 1924, it was being called, along with other movies, a Jazz Age film. There's only one problem. It was ardently pro-prohibition. In fact, a contemporary reviewer called it a propaganda film for its direct and strong stance against illegal alcohol. There was a foreword at the beginning of the film from the head of Universal Pictures, Carl Laemmle himself, telling the audience of his distaste for illegal drinking, and saying, "If there is anything in the world I despise, it is a bootlegger." Perhaps if we could watch the movie now, it might gain the reputation of being unintentionally funny, like Reefer Madness. As for the story, it seems like it was really simple. A debutante, Angela Warrener, makes her social premiere at a ball, but that same night, unbeknownst to her, her father John finds out that his business has failed and he's now bankrupt. The man's wife persuades him to go into the illegal alcohol business with a bootlegger, but without Angela knowing. This results in a roadhouse called Wildwood. The wife develops a drinking habit, and then loses her sight from bootleg hooch. Angela falls for Harry, a man of the fast set, becomes a flapper, and is then trapped in a raid by federal prohibition officers. She is saved by Carl, a more respectable young man, and a friend of the family. Angela then spurns Harry and marries Carl, and her mother regains her sight. So, what did the reviewers think of it? One said it was hailed as one of the most modern of the modern society pictures. That reviewer was Universal's own magazine, Universal Weekly. Actual reviews of Wine leaned negative. Carl Sandburg, though, had a pretty positive view of the movie, writing, "The picture is a snappy, zippy, overdrawn sketch of life as it is lived in the underground and among the upper classes. If not taken as information, it is cracking good entertainment." Photoplay magazine wrote that the plot was weak. The Film Daily said, "The story is cheap and sensational, chiefly in a series of wild and wet parties participated in by the flapper heroine and her jazzy playmates." I was also able to find a lengthy, rather negative review that I would like to share in full, so here it goes. This picture starts out by frankly stating in a foreword that it is propaganda, in favor of exterminating the bootlegger and those who aid in the dispensing of illicit liquor. But as a matter of fact, it registers rather as plain melodrama, the plot of which pivots on rum running and the consequences thereof, with jazz and flapper trimmings, the sort of thing which has served as screen material quite frequently of late. Viewed from any angle, Wine cannot be classed as a film of extraordinary merit. It belongs in the program list, and should do pretty fair business in the average house before an average audience. But on the whole, it doesn't measure up to the high watermark of the usual Jewel productions. 3 members of the Warrener family suffer as a result of their connection with the purchase and absorbing of hooch in defiance of the Volstead decree. Papa Warrener gets in bad through partnership with a bootlegger. Mother goes temporarily blind through overindulgence in the forbidden stuff. Daughter flaps into an ugly mess of liquor and jazz complications. And there is the customary round of gay parties and convivial excess with which movie fans are quite familiar. There are many exciting situations, among which may be mentioned the roadhouse raid and heroine's narrow escape from officers of the law, with her faithful lover coming to the rescue. Shots of a floating cafe in the shape of a vessel anchored safely outside the 12-mile limit and catering to thirsty Gothamites are very interesting. All the more so because a New York morning newspaper recently printed an article dealing with the activities of a steamer engaged in such traffic just off Fire Island. The moral lesson the producers hint at in the foreword loses its edge somewhat when the climax presents the mother as recovering from her whiskey blindness, daughter happy with her fiancé, and father pulling loose from the clutches of the law. Another negative review, this one from Motion Picture Magazine, said, "As screen fare, it is a rather aimless and wholly conventional flapper film. The development of the episodes is very tiresome after several rounds of gaiety over the cheering cups." As for Clara Bow, she hadn't yet become a sensation, and the general reaction was that she was all right but not great as a flapper character. The Film Daily said, "Clara Bow can't duplicate Colleen Moore's characterization of the flapper no matter how hard she tries, but she's a jazzy kid, that much can be said for her." But there's also an interesting little aside concerning this movie that you heard mentioned in that long review a little while ago. Before the movie was released, a writer from the New York Herald Tribune claimed to have discovered a vessel anchored 15 miles off of New York that was operating as a floating bar. Coincidentally, there was a similar ship in Wine, which was called the 12-Mile Cafe, referring to the prohibition rule that if you were more than 12 miles offshore, alcohol could be served to you legally. Wine was originally planned to be released in late December 1924, but because of this hot scoop in the news, they pushed up its release date to August to take advantage of the exposure, and proceeded to milk it for all it was worth. Some apparently found the timing suspicious, and Universal even had to officially state that they had nothing to do with the news story, which turned out to be a hoax anyway, and had not conjured it up as a publicity stunt for Wine. So, while Wine was definitely not a masterpiece, I think it would be a fantastic movie in terms of pop culture for how it combined so many quintessentially 1920s things all in one. If this film is ever found, I'm sure anyone making videos on prohibition or alcohol in the 1920s would use clips from it as perfect 1920s footage for that. The story was something that had already been done before, and didn't add much that was new. It was sensationalistic, but also moralizing, which sounds a bit like Flaming Youth. But Wine came out more than 9 months after Flaming Youth, and other similar movies had also come out in the time between. And Wine didn't seem to be quite as risque as those, and that had been a huge selling point for many of those earlier movies.
Next, let's go to a different actress who did flapper roles, and another favorite of the channel, Louise Brooks, again. For Louise Brooks fans, 1927 is almost a completely lost year in her filmography. Out of the 4 movies she made that year, only a 23-minute fragment survives from one of them, and her movie Rolled Stockings is not that movie. Like quite a few lost films, if you look it up online, you won't find very much about it at all. And that's a big reason why I started this series in the first place, so I hope I can remove some of the dust that obscures it from the general public. And I found out very quickly that there are a shocking amount of Louise Brooks fans out there, so this one's for you. I also wanted to talk about it because it was a college picture. I've mentioned this before, but I love all the trendy college stuff of the 1920s. It's usually carefree, fun, and very connected to the rapidly changing culture of 1920s America. And there was a mini trend of college-related movies for a little while around 1925, 1926, and 1927, propelled by such popular movies as The Freshman, so Rolled Stockings was part of that little wave. Okay, so what was the story of Rolled Stockings? It's the story of 2 brothers, Jim Treadway, the older brother, and Ralph Treadway, the younger brother. Their father is disappointed when Jim doesn't make the college rowing team, which is a tradition for Treadway men, so his hopes are pinned on Ralph, and Ralph does in fact make the team. Amidst all of this, the 2 brothers fall in love with the same girl, Carol Fleming. On the eve of a big boat race, Ralph finds out that Jim has won Carol when he sees him kiss her, and he abandons the race to drown his sorrows at a seedy roadhouse. Ralph's father and the rowing coach search all over for him, but Jim finds Ralph first and warns him, because if he is caught there by the coach, he will be expelled from the college, and would also greatly upset their father. After a struggle, Ralph escapes just in the nick of time, though Jim is discovered at the roadhouse and takes the blame and is expelled. Ralph then competes in the boat race, which serves as the climax of the movie. I couldn't find much information about the exact details of the ending, but one review described it as a brief and rather obvious twist to a happy ending, so my guess is that Ralph's team won the race one way or another. Perhaps the most controversial thing about this movie was the title, and you might be wondering why, since it seems normal enough. Well, rolled stockings were associated with flappers or flapper-adjacent young women, which in Hollywood were often depicted in risque ways, and there was none of that to be seen in this movie. It's a small thing, but it was a fact that was often mentioned in reviews about it. I guess some people felt misled, or that it was a cheap, though ultimately harmless lie. And as the New York Times review noted, Incidentally, the only rolled stockings in the film appear in a subtitle. Another publication, the film Spectator, was less forgiving. It wrote, "One of the mysteries of rolled stockings is its title. Pickled pig's feet would have been just as appropriate." Louise Brooks would have been the perfect actress for showing off skimpy clothing or risque close-ups of legs, but as the exhibitor's herald noted, not even Louise Brooks got a close-up lower than the neckline. Despite some unfulfilled promises, most of the reviews were still mildly positive, though not raving. Rolled Stockings wasn't intended to be a hugely profitable movie. Paramount used their junior stars, which were some of the younger, less popular but still somewhat known actors. It was obviously just light fare intended for the younger crowd, and because there wasn't anything actually scandalous in it, some reviewers mentioned that it was good for families. What many appreciated was the college atmosphere, and that would probably be one of the biggest reasons people would want to watch it now if it still existed. Among the aspects of college life featured were sports, parties, pranks, and a fraternity initiation. Variety wrote positively, "An exceptional picture of college life is here presented. For once, the motif of college athletics has been handled as a background rather than the center of interest. The screen story is a vast improvement upon the labored idea of a college sporting event upon which hangs the outcome of a romantic situation, such as the long run of the football hero that lifted disgrace from the halfback. The campus atmosphere is splendidly done in a vein of high comedy rather than the familiar rah-rah travesty. These young people are real, in settings recognizable in life. College pictures usually have the tone and mood of a Mack Sennett riot." The movie magazine Screenland went so far as to say that Rolled Stockings was the best college story that's ever been filmed, whereas the New York Herald Tribune wrote that, "The most that one can say for Rolled Stockings is that it is innocuous." A few reviews, though somewhat positive, thought that the climactic boat race at the end was rather disappointing, and the ending was implied to be generic a few times. Most of the complaints about the movie were minor ones, which gives me the impression that it was very run-of-the-mill, with not many glaring flaws, but not much especially memorable either. As I said before, the slightly positive or lukewarm reviews made up the vast majority that I found, but there was one especially negative review from the film Spectator. I quoted the very beginning of it before, and now I'll read through the rest of it, and that will include some arguably very picky criticisms. Despite the review going against the grain at times, it covers a lot about the movie, and gives us a good idea of specific details and scenes, so I'll include a much longer excerpt than I normally would for that reason. Just know that, while it's useful, it didn't necessarily represent the majority of opinions. So this one is for all you super 1920s movie nerds out there. Okay, here it goes. The story is ridiculous, and the picture gives the impression that the director and the cast knew it was, and worked with the single aim of getting through with it. The main weakness of Richard Rawson's direction was his disposition to line up his characters facing the camera. This is a habit that a great many directors have, apparently because someone started doing it a long time ago. No scene can be more natural than the grouping of the characters in it. In the final fade-out, David Torrance, Louise Brooks, James Hall, and Richard Arlen have a get-together session at a railway station. They stand in a straight line facing the camera, an utterly absurd way of presenting them. And even if it were permissible on the ground of naturalness, it is not as effective as if the three young people had faced the father, allowing the camera to register the action by showing their backs. Rolled Stockings has a close-up debauch to its discredit, although Bud Lighton's indulgence in this editorial weakness is not quite as wild as Lloyd Sheldon's in The Whirlwind of Youth. If the simple rule of applying reason to the use of close-ups were adopted in motion picture studios, we would have more pictures displaying intellectual treatment. The opening sequence in Rolled Stockings shows the home of the two boys about to leave for college. Their father and mother are in the scenes with them. It is shown almost entirely in close-ups, thus getting away entirely from the spirit of the sequence. A family is an entity, and when one is shown on the screen solely to establish the family idea, the illusion is weakened by close-ups, which show the different characters as individuals, instead of as parts of something that an effort is being made to present as a whole. The group idea should not be destroyed. Some of the close-ups containing the heads of two people add a humorous touch to this picture. In order to get them within the frame and retain the huge proportions of the heads, the characters have to stand so close together that their noses almost touch while they talk. Such ridiculous scenes are things that make movies out of what might have been motion pictures. If you have not seen this picture, you will realize to what extreme the close-up evil is carried when I tell you that at times, even Louise Brooks's legs are cut in order to give the audience stupendous views of her features. Although it is a college picture, there is no real college atmosphere in it. A long initiation sequence is utterly devoid of either entertainment or humor. In a boat race sequence, yell leaders do their daily dozens in front of groups of elderly people who make no response whatever. Dick Arlen, stroke of his crew, a manly chap who takes to drink on the eve of his race because Louise is going to marry his brother, wears a heavy sweater while rowing in the race. This is the only new thing in the picture, the only thing that never was done before on the screen or in a boat race. Paramount must be hard up for stories when it has to fall back on one which builds its main situation on the fact that the stroke of a crew on the eve of a great race throws down his college by breaking training. It is unheard of. But anyway, the titles and rolled stockings are punctuated properly. It is the only thing to the picture's credit. There is not one single good performance in it.
The Fox Movietone Follies of 1929 was one of the handful of big-budget review-type movies from the short movie musical craze of 1929. Other similar movies like Broadway Melodies and The Hollywood Review of 1929 have survived, so it's a shame that no part of Movietone Follies has survived. By 1929, talkies had completely taken over the movie industry, but were still kind of a novelty. And what better way to showcase the new technology than musicals, something that required sound? Although it was primarily a musical review, there was a story, as almost all of these older reviews felt obligated to include for some reason. It tells the story of a man from Virginia named George Shelby, who sells his plantation for $50,000 and goes to the city to dissuade his sweetheart, Lila Beaumont, from continuing her career on the stage. But she refuses and they have a fight. A bit later, George overhears the owner of the show complaining about finances, so George offers to buy the show for $50,000, the money he got from selling his property. The show's owner, thinking that it'll be a flop, gladly accepts, though doesn't tell George about how bad it really is. George, now the showrunner, tries to fire Lila so that she'll marry him and they can settle down in Virginia, but Lila refuses to be fired and goes on with the show. George then turns the show around and makes a big profit. He then pays back the money to the shocked previous owner. Lila, satisfied that the show was a success, finally agrees to marry George. But no one, and I mean no one, went to this movie or any of the other talkie reviews for the story. They came for the music, the entertainment, and the pageantry. So what was that aspect of the movie like? That's the trickiest part, since it's difficult to write about those kind of things in detail. Usually, reviewers just left vague comments like when this one wrote, "It goes without saying, of course, that the picture is excellent, splendid, wonderful, and any reasonable interpretation of that overworked adjective." Another reviewer wrote, "The necessary ingredients run something like this: catchy music, plenty of pretty girls and keen limbs, snappy tempo, attractive sets, a dash of comedy. Fox Movietone Follies has 'em, and that's exactly what makes the picture what it is. A third reviewer simply exclaimed, "Glorified gals, legs, abbreviated costumes, everything." Instead, we have to settle for little snapshots those reviewers provided, usually highlighting a single memorable part. For example, almost every review I read mentioned that Stepin Fetchit, a black dancer and performer, was one of the best parts of the movie. This is what one person had to say about him. At one time, he is called upon to do a dancing number, filling the place of the regular dancer, who has not appeared at the theater on time. His feet move like lightning. The singing is excellent. Another reviewer mentioned that his sleepy characterization earned many laughs. This sleepy characterization probably referred to Fetchit's specialty of playing characters that were lazy and not too bright on the surface, essentially a black stereotype. It's a kind of character that many today would probably find offensive, but it was what it was. Another reviewer briefly mentioned something about a segment involving Daniel Boone and a shotgun marriage, but I don't know much more than that. Then, of course, there were the songs, which were probably the most memorable things from the movie. And this was one thing that surprised me. There were two songs I already knew and enjoyed that actually came from this movie. These were That's You Baby and Big City Blues, and these were songs I discovered through Annette Hanshaw's recordings of them. Another song titled Walking with Susie was singled out by most as one of the best songs featured, though I'm not personally familiar with that one. The structure of the movie alternated between segments of the review itself with the singing and dancing and the weak story, though these segments went all the way through without interrupting each other. Here's a description from a person who actually saw the movie. My memory for these things isn't so good, but I should say there were 7 or 8 chunks of straight Follies stuff, separated by an equal number of story chunks. The Follies sequences are linked only by the appearance of players in one and the other, which is quite link enough for anyone. While the movie was all in black and white, there was one little extra novelty. One Technicolor sequence. However, all agreed that it served little purpose, and one reviewer described it as very beautiful but hardly appealing to the masses. Overall, the reviews were a bit mixed, or maybe lukewarm is a better word. Here's a sample of one person's general thoughts. Of course, there are songs and a great deal of dialogue, with movement, a sequence in color, and all the ingredients found in this sort of entertainment on the stage. All but cleverness, inspiration, professional ease, call it what you will. The success of a big review depends not only on spectacular beauty, but expert dancing and singing, little of which is found in this screen replica. All the music, bustle, and movement fail to conceal the dearth of talent, nor does it drown the thin, screeching, untrained voices. The reason why there wasn't expert dancing and singing was because Fox used people from its own stock company, people who were mostly not professional dancers or singers. But not many reviewers, except for maybe that last one, really said that this in itself was completely fatal. I think putting Fox Movietone Follies of 1929 in the right context will help you understand why you might have found it exciting at that time. Put yourself in the shoes of an average outside-of-the-city movie watcher in 1929. Maybe you've already seen a talkie or two, but have never seen a live stage show like the Ziegfeld Follies. Watching this movie or any of the similar musical review films would have been a bit of a revelation for you. This technology was so new, which is why the movie studios went all in on them in an explosion of sensations. The format of musical review films was nothing special, and their popularity declined very quickly once people realized that they were all basically the same, some just better put together than others. But that first time you watched something like this would have been really special. And that's what I imagine when I think about the Fox Movietone Follies of 1929. Compared with the other big studio musicals of 1929, Fox Movietone Follies wasn't the best. Nearly all evidence points in that direction. And it was beaten out at the box office by quite a few other review-style movies that used the same formula, but were either better made or upped the ante with a larger-scale production that quickly overshadowed Movietone Follies. The best examples of these are MGM's two movies, The Broadway Melody and The Hollywood Review of 1929, and Warner Brothers' two movies, On with the Show and Gold Diggers of Broadway. But with the exception of Gold Diggers of Broadway, which is partially lost, none of those other films are lost now, leaving Fox Movietone Follies as a sort of missing puzzle piece among big studio musicals. At the very specific time that Movietone Follies was released, there had not yet been an all-color, all-talking movie. And I do mean that very specific time, because the first such movie, On with the Show, premiered only 2 days after Movietone Follies premiered. From then on out, at least for a short time, all-talking, all-color musicals became the thing to make. And since Movietone Follies had only contained one rather forgettable color sequence, it would have been very quickly forgotten, even as a novelty. Many reviewers thought that Movietone Follies would perform far better outside of New York, because it was not quite as good as Broadway shows, and thus would be better suited for audiences who had never seen one before. It's very unlikely that it was anything truly amazing. With cameras still being rather immobile at the time due to the new process of making talkies, you almost definitely wouldn't have seen any of the interesting cinematography that many later lavish musicals had. But it still would have been lavish to some degree. There would have been many interesting costumes, beautiful women, and songs with choreography. It's a perfectionist nightmare that this is pretty much the only big Hollywood musical from 1929 that's lost, so I guess it'll just have to survive as a collection of vague images and ideas. The 1922 movie Penrod was based off an earlier novel by Booth Tarkington, one of the most popular American authors of his day. And it's notable because it featured quite a few big-name child actors, including Peggy Cartwright, Jackie Condon, and Ernie Morrison, all of later Our Gang fame, Baby Peggy, Noah Beery Jr., son of actor Noah Beery Sr. and nephew of actor Wallace Beery, and Wesley Freckles Berry, who played the title character, Penrod. If Jackie Coogan was included, that might have been the greatest cast of child actors ever in a movie. Because this movie was based off of a book, we can more or less understand what the story was by reading the original text, even though the movie probably didn't stick to it exactly. But I'm gonna stick to information only about the movie. This brief summary was taken largely from the exhibitor's trade review, though I have changed it slightly. Penrod, only son of Mr. and Mrs. Schofield, has the reputation of being the orphalest boy in town. With the help of his lieutenant, Sam Williams, Penrod has organized the American Boys Protective Association to protect the independence of boyhood, repeal the curfew laws, and insist upon equality of ages. Penrod breaks up an amateur show staged by socially prominent Mrs. Laura Rubush. Penrod's costume consists of part of his father's cast of red flannels. To hide these, the youngster steals some garments from the janitor, and when these commence to unravel, the stage director hurriedly calls curtain and rushes behind the stage to stop the fight that has started. Penrod is always getting into trouble. His imagination, after seeing a play that exposes the evils of drink, leads him to start a rumor about a worthy husband that horrifies the town. He scandalizes the dancing class by his antics during a cotillion and a bad case of hives. He falls off a roof to escape going to a dance where his suit with Pretty Marjorie is eclipsed by Maurice Levy, who is a model of propriety. Penrod makes himself so obnoxious around his sister and her suitor that the latter gives the boy $2 to clear out. A trip to the circus follows, and the visiting physician that evening prescribes castor oil. Rube Collins, tough boy of town, visits the ABPA and bullies the whole gang until he runs afoul of Herman and Vermin, the two colored boys. The two boys get rid of him with the use of scythes and lawnmowers in hair-raising manner. The existence of the ABPA is jeopardized. The irrepressible cutting up of its members has aroused the ire of all the leading citizens, but the boys effect the capture of two notorious bandits who have been terrorizing the neighborhood, and the threats of excoriation are turned into paeans of praise. So many times when I come to the part of each segment talking about reviews of the film, I often say that it was panned or had lukewarm reviews, but in the case of Penrod, most people wrote rave reviews, and it's not hard to imagine why. In the early 1920s, Hollywood really figured out how profitable child stars could be. At that time, we can see the rise of child stars like Jackie Coogan and Baby Peggy, as well as the entire cast of Our Gang. And if you've ever seen any films with those child stars in them, you'll know that they're often very good. Many of these kids were fine actors, or at least had enough spunk to win audiences over. Wesley Berry especially was a very popular child actor in 1922, though has sadly been almost completely forgotten over the years, probably partly due to many of his films being lost. The original Penrod stories by Booth Tarkington were episodic, so there wasn't one central storyline, and the movie followed a similar format, though it was updated to fit the new decade. One example of these modernizations was when a jazz band was introduced, and Penrod requests Paul Whiteman's latest, and shows off his modern dance moves. Because of the format of the film, not every review mentions the same parts, so here are some other descriptions of scenes from the movie so you can get a better picture of what it was like. This isn't really one scene exactly, but Penrod and his friends have a cave that's the sort of headquarters of their so-called American Boys Protective Association, which has lodge rooms and enough space to hold all of the 30 members. Here, they have initiations and secret meetings. Penrod also has a dog who is his main companion. Penrod, trying to read an unnamed forbidden book in secret, hides behind a Victrola, but the dog gives away his hiding place. And in perhaps the most memorable scene for reviewers, Penrod is forced to dance with Baby Peggy's character instead of the older girl he actually wants to dance with. One of the only complaints some reviewers had was that the format of episodic scenes got a bit stale, and the movie could have been shorter, though it didn't ruin it. As this one reviewer from Variety explained, "Were it not for its length, 8 reels, Penrod would be one of the cleanest, healthiest, and most wholesome feature pictures ever turned out. Amusing to the highest degree, it somehow becomes tiresome through its over-footage, and one cannot help thinking how preferable if some of the simple incidents had been omitted. None of the scenes is prolonged, but there are so many. It is like calling on friends and having the child of the house perform his little stunts. You are entertained for a time, but after a while you long for the time to put the youngster to bed." The movie consisted of about 8,000 feet of film, which roughly calculates to a little bit under an hour and a half, at least according to a converter I found online. So perhaps shortening it a little bit might have helped it not make it feel like it was dragging on for too long. It was very common to have feature films that were only 70 minutes or so it wouldn't have been out of place. And there were some comments about Clara Horton being miscast for her role. As the reviewer for Moving Picture World explained, "It is too bad Mr. Nealon strikes the only discordant note of the picture by casting Clara Horton as the amber-curled Marjorie Jones, for she is undeniably an older girl conscientiously trying to act childish, and slightly overdoing it." But in general, reviews of Penrod often read like this: Reels and reels of pure joy. You'll sit spellbound until you are so old and sour that you've forgotten the days when you were Penrod's age. A regular review of this is impossible. A picture you can sit through again and again and laugh more heartily every time. Chuckles and guffaws and shrieks, according to the scenes presented. Yes, it's all in the film. The pageant, perhaps the funniest thing on celluloid. Penrod's party and the new Wiggly dances, all performed for your benefit. Almost every scene is charming or funny. So it's clear that Penrod was a great movie for parents to take their children to, because kids as well as adults could enjoy the humor. It seems to me that, like other popular movies with child stars in the early 1920s, Penrod had a great production team behind it to make clever gags and really take advantage of the funny way kids often behave. The director, Marshall Nealon, had quite a bit of experience in these kid pictures. And specifically, he had worked with Wesley Berry in a few features before making Penrod, so they both would have understood the winning formula by that point. In these kinds of movies, the witty gags, jokes, and spoofs were reminiscent of something out of a Harold Lloyd movie at their best. And for that reason, I would love to be able to watch this movie someday. Next, we have a film adaptation of a novel, one of my new favorite 1920s books, Main Street, written by Sinclair Lewis. Lewis might have been the most famous American author in the 1920s, and his novels skillfully rode the line of widespread appeal and acceptance in the literary world. And at the time, Lewis's mainstream relevance certainly lasted longer than the likes of F. Scott Fitzgerald's. After Fitzgerald largely faded away from popularity in the second half of the decade, Lewis was still writing massive bestsellers. Lewis's first hit of the 1920s was Main Street, published in 1920. To say that it was huge is actually a bit of an understatement. Despite not having quite the long-lasting legacy of some other novels from the decade, it was in the running for the most popular novel of the 1920s as a whole. It was the best-selling novel of 1921, and was voted to win the Pulitzer Prize for Literature that same year, but this decision was actually overturned, which was apparently something that could happen. And oh, look at that, I did a review and analysis video on the book, so you can check that out if you want. Anyway, given such mainstream popularity and critical success, it was almost inevitable that Main Street would be made into a movie. And after about 2 years, Warner Brothers took on the job. And it's also their fault that the movie is lost. The negative was junked by the studio in 1948, and that seems to be the last known mention of any surviving copy. It was a bit difficult to find detailed summaries of the movie's version of the plot, because I'm sure reviewers just assumed that most people knew the basic premise of the book, since it was so popular. But here's a mostly complete reconstruction of the movie's summary. The main character is a young woman named Carol, played by Florence Vidor, who is from the city. She marries a doctor named Will Kennicott, played by Monty Blue, and thus becomes Carol Kennicott. She agrees to move with him to his hometown of Gopher Prairie, a very small town. It's presented as a typical American small town, with one main street, which is where the title comes from. Carol has trouble fitting in with the townsfolk, and her ideals are often diametrically opposed to those of the locals. She wants to reform the town, to make it more sophisticated and respectable, but she has little luck in changing the stubborn, unchanging attitude of Gopher Prairie. Her difficulty of adjusting to small-town life reveals that Will Kennicott doesn't really understand his new wife all that well. While Will is kind and a faithful husband, this situation isolates the couple a bit. Carol finds friendship with some outsiders in town, namely a Swedish servant girl named Bee Sorensen and a young man named Eric Valborg. Eric falls in love with Carol and asks her to run away with him and get married, but Carol refuses. Eric's father has a grudge against Will because Will felt it necessary to amputate the man's arm. This grudge extends to Carol, at the very least due to association. So, when Eric's father sees his son with her, he denounces Carol to the town. The townsfolk turn on Carol, but then Will comes to Carol's defense and tells the mob off. Eric then admits that Carol is innocent of this accusation of indecency. Now, Carol sees Will's love for her in action, but also realizes that she will never be able to change Gopher Prairie or its people. Alright, so that's where the movie ends. Maybe. I did find one single blurb in Exhibitor's trade review that stated that in the movie, Carol goes to live in Washington alone, and Will eventually comes to see her to reconcile, just like in the book. We can't always rely 100% on the accuracy of these reviews, and the fact that I could only find one that mentioned this seemingly important development is a bit suspicious, but I digress. If you've read the book, you're probably wondering where many of the characters were in the movie's story. We briefly heard of B. Sorensen, but little more than a mention. And where's Miles Bjornstam? Where's Guy Pollock? Where's Vita Sherwin, Fern Mullins, Olaf Bjornstam, or Carol and Will's children? Some of those characters were present in the movie, but not all. Here's a list of all the credited characters. We can see that Miles is there, as is Guy Pollock, but important characters in the book like Vita Sherwin and Fern Mullins are nowhere to be seen. There's a very understandable reason for this. Main Street the novel is long, with a lot of characters. Main Street the movie already had a list of named characters considerably longer than normal. There just wasn't enough room for all of them. The bigger mystery for me is, for the side characters in the movie, what did they actually do? All of the summaries I found focused exclusively on the main storyline, with Carol, Will, and Eric, but there's little mention of how the others were used. B. Sorensen, played by Louise Fazenda, was apparently some sort of comic relief, which makes sense if you remember that Louise Fazenda played a character with a similar purpose in Babe Comes Home. The purpose of B was probably just for that, rather than for moving the story along. As for Miles Bjornstam, I couldn't find anything about what he did in the movie. In the book, Miles serves as the antithesis of Gopher Prairie, so his symbolic importance was crucial to the commentary. The movie seemed to be content just using Eric Valborg for similar purposes. As in the book, he represented everything Carol thought she wanted. I also couldn't find out if Miles and Bee get married, as they do in the book. And if they didn't get married, then their son Olaf wouldn't be there either. There was also no mention of Carol and Will's children. And then there's the Fern Mullins episode. Like I said before, there probably just wasn't enough room for it, and my theory is that it was too inappropriate to include anyway. In the book, Fern is a school teacher who's accused of being romantically involved with one of her older students and giving him alcohol, and she gets viciously run out of town, despite none of it being true. Her career was permanently ruined by the scandal. Even though the movie didn't completely avoid lampooning small-town folks, that storyline was probably a bit too brutal for theaters, since it really exposes the ugliest side of the people of Gopher Prairie. The makers of the movie probably felt the need to walk the line so as not to completely distort the message of the novel, but also not offend small-town viewers too much. After all, Gopher Prairie was implied to be the same as other small towns in America, so those viewers might feel personally targeted for criticism. I don't want to focus too much more on the differences between the movie and the book, though I do want to mention one more thing. Reviews for the movie talk quite a bit about a big winter ice carnival event that Warner Brothers spent a lot of time and money putting together. I couldn't really find out how it fit into the story, but I did find an interesting behind-the-scenes description of the whole thing that I'll quote in full. What is described as a snowstorm deluxe in the sense that it is a dazzling spectacle of a winter carnival was filmed at the Warner Studios. The entire set is said to have been covered with white sand, tons of fine salt, and a composition which made it glisten like the real thing. A huge ski slide was constructed and covered with ice, at the bottom of which was a large frozen pond. 3 professional ski jumpers were engaged for this particular scene, and a number of professional skaters gave exhibitions of fancy skating. For this carnival, fully 1,000 extras are reported to have been engaged, and that it took 3 nights to film the scenes which culminated in a blizzard. Okay, now let's turn to some reviews. One newspaper went so far as to say that Main Street was one of the greatest pictures the motion picture industry has turned out, and put it up in the ranks with recent big hits like The Covered Wagon and Robin Hood. A magazine review said positively of the movie, "In filming Sinclair Lewis's widely read novel, they have taken a story, basically a vivid character drawing with the plot seemingly intangible, and made it a living, breathing picture panorama, fairly saturated with love interest, human touches, and good everyday hokum that will get anybody anywhere, in the tank towns as well as the first-run theaters. Director Harry Beaumont has injected a potent message, humanly told, with romance, suspense, and comedy so exquisitely blended that it cannot help but make people want to see it time and time again. It is a great picture for women in the audience. Mr. Exhibitor, book Main Street by all means. Just tell the town you have it and sit back and watch the shekels roll in at the box office. Then, when the show is over, watch the audience leave with that happy, contented grin on its face that is always there when a picture makes a big hit, especially with the women, as does Main Street." The movie magazine Screenland wrote in its review, "But it is a corking good picture. Hokum? Yes, gobs of it, of the surefire kind that keeps an audience in an uproar, or a titter, or in tears. Very cunningly, the picture does what the book failed to do. It leaves you with a feeling that Main Street is about as broad after all as Fifth Avenue, that futile discontent and snobbish gropings for vague ideas are less lovely than honest ugliness." Other reviews of the premiere said that the movie was too long and would have to be cut. And Variety said that it was, in fact, cut down considerably after the premiere. And with the more negative reviews, we have to address the elephant in the room, the relationship between the book and the movie, and how that affected the movie's reception. Nearly every review, positive or negative, said that the movie was very different from the book. This cannot be surprising to anyone even today, where we still have debates about this exact problem. Those who gave their reviews a positive spin sometimes said something to the effect of what the Exhibitor's Herald wrote in its review. "If you haven't read the book, you'll enjoy Main Street on the screen with greater relish than those who have already perused the much-discussed Sinclair Lewis novel." Photoplay commented on the predictable outcome of adapting such a novel to film. "We anticipated failure in the transfer of Sinclair Lewis's Main Street to the screen. Only a great director could transfer either the physical or the mental side of the Lewis study in small-townism. Only he could capture the microscopic detail of Lewis's word painting or catch the mental clash of the characters. Yet for 2 reels, this film Main Street is good." Now, regarding that last sentence, it should be noted that Main Street was listed as having 8 reels. From the Exhibitor's perspective, there was some concern about the content and message of the movie negatively affecting interest in small-town theaters. While the movie appears to have toned down the biting satire at small-town folks' expense, it still made them out to be nosy, bullheaded, and decidedly unprogressive. One movie magazine spoke to this. "We quarrel with the general conception of the inhabitants of Gopher Prairie. There is a marked tendency to make them the types you find cast in stories of small towns for comedy relief. It doesn't seem to us that they should be just that." An anonymous person wrote a letter to the editor of Motion Picture Magazine about how they didn't expect such a movie like Main Street to be successful in small towns. "For more than a year, the public has been treated to stories about small towns. Pictures like Main Street leave a kind of distaste in the mouth after seeing them. Most people in small towns live like the people in these pictures, and that is the main reason that they are distasteful. These people like to see a picture that takes them away from the cares of their daily lives, and the small town plays bring said cares back to them. They like to forget everything around them and lose themselves in the picture. People in the same position as Carol Kennicott would become discouraged when reading the book or seeing the play of Main Street. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention before that a Main Street stage play was also made in 1921. So overall, Main Street was probably a fairly decent movie, though might have been disappointing if you were a fan of the book. Everyone praised the cast for their performances, so no problems there. It was predictable and understandable that the movie couldn't possibly explore the small-town psyche as deeply or on the same scale as the book for time constraints alone. And though the movie is lost, we still have the book, and I can't recommend it enough. So check it out if you're interested, or check out my video about it for a short discussion. Okay, next up is Remodeling Her Husband, released in 1920. The main reason why this movie is remembered at all is because it was the only film that actress Lillian Gish ever directed. Gish was at the peak of her fame in 1920, along with her sister Dorothy. While Lillian usually did more dramatic roles, Dorothy was known for her comedy. And interestingly, Dorothy had the main role in Remodeling Her Husband. And as a side note, it's possible, though not confirmed, that D.W. Griffith had some input in the movie as well. What might be just as interesting as Lillian Gish directing is that she and Dorothy also wrote the script. According to a later account by Lillian, Dorothy got the idea for the script in a magazine cartoon. And the writer for the intertitles was Dorothy Parker, famous for her wit and satire. Although it seems like Parker's involvement in the movie hasn't been completely confirmed. But if that's true, then that means that the writers, the director, and the leading player for this movie were all women. Lillian Gish was certainly not the first woman to direct a movie. Neither she nor her sister were the first women to write a movie script. Dorothy Parker was not the first woman to write intertitles. And Dorothy Gish was obviously not the first top-billed movie actress. But this combination was definitely a bit unusual, and the director role was the one most uncommonly filled by women, especially in Hollywood. But what was the movie about? Fortunately, there was a short story version published in the movie magazine Motion Picture Classic, so the story is known in detail. And without that print version, I would have had about half as many movie stills for this section of the video. However, it's hard to tell how many of the details were actually in the film version, so I didn't include some of the ones from the short story version if it seemed like it didn't match what the movie reviews said. And of course, the movie wouldn't have had nearly as much spoken dialogue as in the short story version. But anyway, here's the summary. The setting is New York City. The main character is a woman named Janie Wakefield, who marries a flirty man named Jack Valentine. Janie doesn't like Jack's flirty ways, and he promises to change. But one day, while she's shopping on Fifth Avenue, Janie sees Jack helping a blonde woman with her suitcase as she gets into a taxi, then rides in the taxi with her, and leads the woman to the door of her house. Janie found this out because she followed his taxi in another taxi, and then she apparently saw him kiss her, presumably on the cheek. This was all purely innocent, according to Jack later on, but Janie doesn't know that at the time, and assumes the worst. Jack is eventually able to convince her that it wasn't what she thought it was. But not long after that, Jack falls for another woman, Mabel, who is a manicurist. Mabel was actually Janie's manicurist, and one day Jack says he thinks he should get a manicure for himself. Janie, not suspicious, recommends Mabel to him. But one day, Janie sees the flirtatious look that Jack gives Mabel, and she starts to have doubts. Janie returns unexpectedly early from another shopping excursion to find Jack and Mabel doing something other than manicuring, probably an intimate kiss. Seeing this makes Janie flee home to her mother. She then gets a job at her father's office and becomes rather successful. Jack tries to contact Janie through letters, but she burns them. He tries to call her, but she won't take the calls and ignores his messages. Jack truly does love Janie, so he's distraught and tries to win her back. Somehow, he finds out where she's working, and he goes to her. Janie, not in a forgiving mood, pushes the button on her desk to have Jack escorted out of the building. While being taken away, Jack threatens to kill himself, and Janie caves to her feelings for him, and they reconcile again. Finding reviews for Remodeling Her Husband was not as easy as some of the other Lost films I've looked into. But from the reactions I did find, it was not positive. One review from Exhibitor's Herald was pretty cynical about it when it said, "Someone should take Lillian to one side and tell her to stick to acting and let others do the directing of her sister's plays." Remodeling Her Husband is Lillian's first offense to the critics, who will probably treat it charitably for this reason. But whoever it is around the famous player's plat that passes on its finished product was certainly asleep the day they slipped this one by. It is a very amateurish piece of work. There's a point here. Lillian Gish was very popular and well-respected in Hollywood in 1920. And she was comparable to the untouchable Queen of Hollywood, Mary Pickford, in many ways. She usually played innocent ingenues, and that innocent image was often projected onto her as a person. And nobody wants to hurt an ingenue. So it's not too hard to see how the industry and critics might have wanted to be nice about her debut so as not to hurt her feelings or offend her. And if that really was the case, then a lot of small, soft criticisms might be amplified to show the true reactions. One review from the movie magazine Motion Picture Classic may have been trying to cushion the fall when it said, "After observing Remodeling Her Husband, we are confident that Lillian Gish could easily develop into a director of fine originality." You could interpret that to mean that she wasn't a director of fine originality yet, in a sort of soft criticism, but the review leaves the future possibility hanging in the air as a convenient out. But they would never find out because Lillian Gish never directed another movie. Some thought the story was to blame. To be sure, it isn't an entirely interesting story in itself, and seemed very standard fare for the time. It often takes a very skilled and experienced director to turn something so normal into something of real substance. But of course, this was Lillian's first attempt at directing. She would later write that she just had a craving to direct a movie, and after it was finished, she didn't really want to do it again. It was just an experiment for her. It's not like the movie took a big risk anyway. It was given a modest budget, was finished in a month, and did all right at the box office. What pretty much everyone did agree on was that Dorothy Gish, playing the lead role, was as entertaining as ever. Despite a rather conventional plot and a novice director, Dorothy didn't disappoint. The trade magazine Motion Picture News went as far as to say that Dorothy saved the picture from total failure, saying, "Only the presence of Dorothy Gish, with her undeniable charm and inimitable comedy, saves this piece from becoming a tiresome entertainment. We can think of no other actress who can endow the tried-and-true role of the young bride, whose object is to tame her husband, with so much color and personality. Whatever appeal this picture has is found in her performance. There are moments when the action drags, but for the most part, Dorothy Gish is there sending out shafts of her quaint humor." Variety chimed in by saying, "It is a picture that is Dorothy Gish, hook, line, and sinker, and it would sink if it weren't for her." So it's very clear who the winner was among the two sisters in this situation. One particular scene that I saw cited a couple of times was when Janie humorously tries to attract men in a public park. This was the most memorable part for some who wrote about the movie, but I have no idea where in the movie this scene happened. Despite this movie being a comedy drama, the summaries and reviews didn't really reflect the comedy aspect very much, probably because it was incidental to the story. The drama propelled the plot, and the comedy might have been inserted as a kind of distraction, or as an attempt to give the movie a kind of emotional roller coaster effect. From everything I could find, it seems that the consensus was that Remodeling Her Husband was, at best, nothing special. But knowing that it was the legendary Lillian Gish's only directed movie, it will never fail to make us wonder what it actually was like.
The next movie was an adaptation of a novel. But this one wasn't a contemporary story, but the 1883 novel Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. It certainly wasn't the first film adaptation of that novel, it was actually the fifth, and another studio made an adaptation only 2 years before in 1918, but this one was the only one from the 1920s. I've never actually read the original novel, so I can't really compare how the movie was different from the book. But even all the way back in 1920, people were complaining about how unfaithful a movie is to the original source, and that's kind of what happened here. So I guess it's one of those things that never really goes away. But since the basic story is so famous, I know that it's about a boy who gets involved with pirates, and there's a search for buried treasure. This story pretty much colored our vision about what pirates were like, and spawned, or at least further perpetuated, the familiar pirate stereotypes. A lot of reviewers didn't bother writing a detailed summary of the movie because they assumed most people would already be familiar with the basic plot. But fortunately, I found a pretty good summary of the story in the Exhibitor's Herald, so I think it'll be easier if I just read it out verbatim. So here it goes. Jim Hawkins and his mother keep Benbow Tavern on the English coast, but business is poor. It is patronized by seafaring men, and one day is visited by Captain Bill Bones. It is whispered about that he is an ex-pirate. Soon afterward, Black Dog, a ferocious-looking sailor, appears, and after a wordy battle, Bill Bones drives him away. Later he returns and kills the captain. Jim searches the captain's chest and finds the chart of a buried treasure. The tavern is ransacked by the seamen, but Jim and his mother escape. The village squire and doctor fit out a ship to hunt the treasure. Jim is forbidden to go, but stows away in the vessel and overhears Mary, Morgan, and others of the rough crew planning to mutiny. The squire is told and the mutineers are overpowered and set ashore. They kidnap Jim, but he escapes. A battle takes place on the island, and the squire and his party win out. Jim discovers the treasure, and after killing off most of the crew, they sail for home. For those who have read the book, you can chime in the comments about what the differences are. One of the reviews I found specifically listed one of them. So in the book, Jim Hawkins, the main boy character, was apparently invited to join the group of pirates. But in this movie, as the summary said, he was a stowaway on their ship. So how did Treasure Island fare with the critics? As I said before, there were quite a few comments about how the movie differed drastically from the book, which was pretty much inevitable. Among the reviewers, it seemed like a split right down the middle about whether the director, Maurice Tourneur, had made the right calls when diverging from the book. Some thought it was still pretty good despite not being accurate, and others thought it wasn't so great as a result of not being accurate. Photoplay magazine said, "It might be said that he has been very free in his translation of Treasure Island from literature to the screen. It is Mr. Tourneur's version which suffers. He has juggled the plot and has introduced a great deal of action of his own, some of which is very ingenious. But in attempting to paint the lily, he has cheapened it by more than one tawdry stroke. Nevertheless, he has made a very entertaining story of a hunt for buried treasure." These reviews make up a fairly small sample size, but they seem relatively forgiving about not sticking too closely to the book, as long as they were entertained. A writer in Picture Play magazine defended these artistic licenses when they said, That Tourneur saw fit to alter materially the plot in a few places has been objected to by some lovers of the book. Yet I have heard others, craftsmen in the writing game, who defended the changes, arguing that, for the purpose of making a play, Tourneur was justified in abandoning the random romance, and in changing it so as to heighten some of its dramatic moments. Just as in Human Wreckage, Variety seemed to have a valid criticism of Treasure Island, but then went off on a weird editorial tangent that just made me shake my head, so I have to share it. Maurice Tourneur is a Frenchman, and seems incapable of making the most of an Anglo-Saxon subject, and for a simple enough reason. Give equally able French and English writers the same melodramatic scenario for a novel. The Frenchman will work from cause to effect in the Balzac manner. The Englishman or American will gild the framework with sentiment and description. This is what Mr. Tourneur forgets. Given an English story for screening, and he strips it of sentiment and description. Of course, he doesn't put in the French psychology, the stepping from cause to effect, because that is too heavy for pictures. He takes merely the skeleton and throws in what seem to him good pictorial effects. The result is a decorated framework that never seems solid or convincing. Maybe it's just because I'm an American in the modern day, but I've often read things from back in the day that make out British and French people as being like practically different species. I just thought it was weird that the director was kind of being criticized for being French, and lacking the ability to carry out his duties effectively for that reason. I don't know. But moving on from that weird tangent, by far, Tourneur's most controversial decision was casting actress Shirley Mason as the lead boy character, Jim Hawkins. Nearly every reviewer had to give their opinion about it. The Exhibitor's Herald thought she was splendid in the role. Motion Picture News took a slightly negative, though sympathetic view when it wrote that Mason, try as she might, is unable to make the character convincing because of her sex. Photoplay magazine called her casting an inaccuracy in the translation, but it is one we do not mind. Heaven forbid a motion picture without a woman. Variety chimed in that, at times, she is more a girl than the boy she is supposed to be, but against the background of piracy and murder, her features stand out winsome as youth, romantic as the dream of a child. The Film Daily agreed, writing, "Some may discover her femininity cropping out at awkward times." Motion Picture Magazine was a bit more peeved about the decision, and asked, "Why did Maurice Tourneur go to work and put a girl in the leading boy's part?" Anyway, compared with the other films featured in this series, reviews for Treasure Island were pretty vague. Most of the biggest complaints were things I covered before, like accuracy to the book and Shirley Mason as Jim Hawkins. There was also a little bit of criticism that the first part of the movie was a bit slow, though the later action balanced it out. Even reviewers who weren't big fans of the movie admitted that it would probably be at least somewhat of a hit at the box office, though I couldn't find any good statistics about its performance. Among the praises for the film were that it was action-packed, and the characters were very lively and memorable. And an interesting note about two of the side characters is that Lon Chaney played a double role of Blind Pew and Mary. One review described the movie as something that would be nostalgic for men who had read the book in their youth and an exciting adventure for young boys of the new generation. So overall, Treasure Island seems like it was a pretty solid movie if you like action and adventure sort of stories. Nothing that would blow your mind, but something that would provide an hour or two of escapism.
Alright, if you made it to the end of this ridiculously long video, thank you. Here's your bonus photo. I know not everyone watches these long compilation videos, but longer videos are better for ad revenue, so having viewers that put them on while they're doing chores or something is really great for the channel. So if you know anyone who's looking for stuff like that, please spread the word. And also, if you want to help out the channel more, you can become a paid member of my Patreon. This will allow me to get more 1920s artifacts for videos. And you can get bonus content from me, where I talk about all the historical things in my private collection from all time periods. I will have a brand new Lost Films video coming up in the sort of near future. But that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.